All right, just real quick before we start. Is it all right if I ask Brian to read the statement about COVID, and then you, Cliff, read the, let's see, oh, I guess that's in the evening meeting.
That's later, but I could read, one of us could read that statement if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, I'd prefer that. Is Brian here? I don't see. Oh,
I'm here. I'm still trying to open the chair notes to get to it. Okay, I think I have it.
Okay, great. All right. Otherwise, I am ready to go.
Okay. You want to call the meeting to order, Dave, and then I'll do the date and time, and then I'll read it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Provo Municipal Council work session for November 10th, 2020. It is 1:06 p.m. on Tuesday. And so let's start with a statement about the electronic means by which we are meeting.
Great.
Mr. Jones?
This meeting will be conducted entirely via electronic means. On November 5th, 2020, in accordance with Utah Code 52-4-207, Sub 4, the Council Chair, George Handley, determined that conducting meetings of the Municipal Council with an anchor location, such as the Municipal Council Chamber, presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present there. These are the facts upon which Mr. Handley has made this determination. The World Health Organization has classified novel coronavirus disease, also known as COVID-19, as a pandemic. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention state that COVID-19 is easily spread from person to person between people who are in close contact with one another. The state of Utah is currently subject to a public health emergency order, which limits the size of public gatherings and which requires people to wear face coverings and follow social distancing guidelines. Utah County is currently listed as having a high level of coronavirus transmission. Physical distancing measures will be difficult to set up and maintain in the Provo City Municipal Council Chamber and other meeting rooms. Additionally, the chair of the governing board of the Redevelopment Agency of Provo City has determined that its meetings are subject to the same risks and has adopted the same procedures as the municipal council. The meeting will be available to the public for live broadcast and on-demand viewing at youtube.com/Provo City Council.
Great. And I noticed that our fearless leader, Chair George Handley, has joined us. So, George, let me read this quick note, and then I will hand off the roll call to you, if that works.
Yeah.
All right. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear.
All right, thank you, everyone. I apologize. I seem to be having some difficulty with my Wi-Fi, so I'm now operating on iPhone hotspot. So hopefully we'll get that resolved before my phone dies. I will state the names of those who are present here. I am George Handley, Council Chair. I'm joined by Dave Harding, Vice Chair, and fellow council members Travis Hoban, Dave Shipley, Bill Fillmore, Dave Sewell, and Shannon Ellsworth, and also by Cliff Strachan, our Executive Director, Brian Jones, our Council Attorney, Wayne Parker, our Chief Administrative Officer, and other staff who are assisting us with this meeting. And I assume we will be joined by the mayor shortly. So we'll begin then with an opening prayer, and that will be offered by Mr. David Harding. Go ahead, Mr. Harding.
Thank you. Our Father in heaven, we are grateful to thee for the opportunity we have to gather to discuss the affairs of the city. We are grateful for this city and the community that we live in, for the state, for the leaders we have, and for the good people that live here. We're grateful for the great country that we live in, and for so many who are working across the country to make it a better place. And we are grateful for the diverse people and cultures throughout the world, and for this amazing world that we are blessed with. We ask Thee to help us to keep in mind this planet and keep in mind all those who live here as we make decisions that affect those locally as well as globally. We ask for wisdom in the decisions that we will make today. We ask for Thy guidance and direction in our discussions. Help us to always have the best interests of the people of Provo at heart as we discuss these things and listen to the presentations that will be given to us today. We ask Thee to bless the presenters that they may speak clearly and may convey the ideas that they plan to present. And we ask for a blessing upon all of our residents. We ask for a blessing upon all of the employees of Provo City, particularly those who put themselves in harm's way to serve us. We ask for a blessing upon our community as we face many challenges, including the pandemic. Bless those who are ill, bless those who are caring for them, and bless all those who are doing their best to slow the spread. And this we pray for in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. All right, well, although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the council chair. Please use the raise hand function to indicate that you would like to speak, and please wait to speak until called on by the council chair. We'll begin our first item on the agenda is a resolution appointing an audit firm. Mr. Cliff Strachan, our executive director, will present this item.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. So 5 years ago, the city council did an RFP, request for proposals for audit services. And this year was the last year of that audit contract that we've had. We engaged HBME, which is then known as Hanson, Bradshaw, Melrose, and Erickson back in 2016. And their fees over the past 5 years range from $43,000 to $47,000. And we have found their work to be most satisfactory and had a good working relationship with them. Given the COVID status and given the experience we've had with them, they are currently doing the last of those 5 years, their contract. And we decided, I was getting prepared to come to you with a request for proposals for the next 3 to 5 years when HBME's manager sent us a letter and indicated that if we would forego the RFP given the circumstances and give them a 3-year extension, they would drop their price from this year's $47,000 to $42,000 for each of the next 3 years. And that seems like a pretty good a good deal and a good reduction for us. So that said, I broached it with council leadership and they seemed favorable, so we pursued it. I sent an email to Dan Follett, who handles the purchasing policies for the city, and he wrote back that they support the idea. They also recommended, felt that it was a good, given the whole COVID and working from home situation, bringing somebody new into the office and trying to train them about our systems and get them to build those relationships and stuff makes it really hard to accomplish in that first year. I have done, early in my career, I've done an audit, and I can tell you it's, especially when you're the first year into a new entity, it's very labor intensive, very hands-on with the people of the city. So what they've written back is that they feel that because of the COVID pandemic, also because of the experience that this group has with us, and because of the a favorable price, Daniel Follett indicated that the city administration supports this deviation from the RFP policy. So I'm recommending this to you for a 3-year contract. One of Daniel's suggestions is that in 3 years that we be certain to go to an RFP at that time. But what you're being asked tonight is to approve a resolution appointing HBME as the auditor for 3 more years and authorizing the council chair to sign the contract, and by association every year we do an engagement letter. So that's what you're being asked to do tonight. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Stragan. Any questions before we return to this item this evening? All right, thank you so much, Mr. Strachan. We'll move on then, and we'll revisit this item evening agenda. We'll go on to item number 2 on our agenda, which is an update on Utah Valley Hospital. And this will be presented by Kyle Hansen, Utah Valley Hospital Administrator, and Janet Frank, Media Manager. We welcome both of you, and thank you for being here. We have 30 minutes for this item.
Excellent. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Technology's working, great. I think I've met many of you. It's been a little over a year, I think, since I had the opportunity to come and speak with the council last year. And that was a great, uneventful year for us. I wish we had less to talk about this year, frankly, from a healthcare system perspective, but it's certainly not our current situation. So I've got a slide deck here I'd like to share with you, if that's okay. See if I can find it. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Excellent. Obviously, what I'd like to do with our time is provide as much real information as I can relative to what's been going on within our hospital. As the COVID hub for Utah County, we treated the majority of the COVID patients in this valley, and as you're aware and hearing, with the case counts on the rise, hospitalizations are on the rise as well, and there's a lot of information and misinformation that's out there relative to what that means and what it's meant for us and what our current state is. And so just an opportunity for me to hopefully clarify where we're at and some of the things that we're doing and working on just relative to the reality that we're facing. So let me maybe just start by hopefully stating the obvious here. Our organization was pretty heavily involved in working with the governor on the latest order that's come out. Certainly we support that fully, and frankly, all actions that help us to slow the spread of this virus. We're being pretty vocal and have been with asking our caregivers to be examples, any of our employees to be examples of this outside of work. We know that many in the community look at our employees working in healthcare for an example and for truth, and certainly it's meaningful if our own people are not adhering to these things. That really sends the wrong message. So we've been quite vocal with them about the role we need them to play. I'd also, I guess, state that feel strongly that this is definitely a team sport, and we need the support of city leaders. We need the support of business leaders in this community and others to help change the attitude and behaviors that maybe are still present with some relative to where their actions may lie relative to what we know we need. So, but as a healthcare system, I think we also honestly believe there's a healthy balance in terms of ensuring we're not overwhelming the healthcare resources and keeping our economy healthy. That's reasonable and can be done. And as I mentioned, we've tried to voice this, I think, with our teams in terms of this approach of we're in this together and we can do this together. And we've got just tremendous caregivers in this hospital serving this community, and I won't do them justice in my presentation today in terms of expressing what they mean to this community and how hard they're working. But we truly have phenomenal people that care deeply about this community and want to be able to continue to care for people that need that. This is just some messaging. We have a lot of resources that we've shared broadly and can continue to share broadly that can be resources for businesses and others. But in terms of messaging to the community, Intermountain's been, I think, fairly vocal in trying to help dispel myths and share information that's useful that employers could use or others can use.
Am I the only one who can't hear him? Mr. Hanson, you
Here's
seem
the
to...
pros, and he may have lost his connection for a moment.
Okay.
Days.
Sorry,
we know
Mr.
we got this 2-week pause, but
He's back.
you froze for just a moment, and I think we lost a minute or so of what you were saying. And maybe he's frozen again.
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, you're freezing a little bit, so we're having trouble hearing what you're saying. Did we lose him altogether, it looks like? All right, we'll give it a minute to see if he can come back. Hello, Mr. Hanson?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, you kept freezing and then you dropped off. So.
Okay. I apologize for that. I'm hardwired here. I'm not on a wireless signal, so let me see if I can pull my presentation back up.
It was the slide about that had the Spanish and English on it, I think, is where we last were. Anyway.
Okay, let me. Yeah.
Here we go.
So, I'm not sure what you heard, but just we have provided a lot of materials, resources to the community, to business owners and others to try and help them in terms of messaging and speaking with their employees about the need and helping to overcome some of those barriers that they may run into. We also know that even though we're in a 2-week pause, there'll likely be need for more help beyond just this 2 weeks. And as we head into the holiday season, we'll continue to message, certainly with our teams, that the social gathering aspect is where we're going to likely need their most help, and that Thanksgiving may look different this year as a result from what's normal. So I have a video I was going to share, but maybe with the technology challenges, it's something worth skipping at this point, just to make sure I'm not testing that. I'm having a little difficulty getting my slide to advance here. Okay. So there's obviously a lot of information swirling about what's going on in our hospitals. We have an inordinate amount of phone calls that we're receiving every day from the community wanting to know, is your ICU really full? Are you providing patients with the same level of care? We have individuals trying to sneak into the hospital to visualize and videotape this themselves. It's created some unique challenges as the public's perception of what's happening here has been difficult with misinformation. But there's a great video Intermountain has that I'll reference you to that kind of is the voice of our frontline workers talking about what it's like to work in an ICU right now inside one of our hospitals. That's pretty powerful. And yeah, we can send you a link to that, Janet. We'll do that just so you have it. But want to maybe move forward and just share some data here with you in terms of what we've experienced so far at the hospital. So just about 750 COVID positive patients that we've treated. 45 have expired. We have roughly 45 patients with COVID in the hospital right now. You can see the numbers that have spent time in our ICU and a smaller percentage of those ICU patients that have had to be on a ventilator. Certainly have seen a larger proportion of our hospitalized patients from the Hispanic or Latinx community, which also jives with what you've seen in some of the higher positivity rates in terms of the case counts. And about 6% of our mortalities have been, as best as we can tell. We don't have perfect data on this, mostly just because we don't require patients to disclose this, but most do select an ethnicity, and these are sort of our best estimates of where the numbers lie. So certainly a disproportionate share based on what we know is representative in the population in the community. This is Utah County case totals, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, and the total hospitalizations, the total deaths for the county. So you get a sense of how many of those have come to us based on that last slide. 30,000 plus cases now. This is data that's a little old, but we know which direction this is still moving in. And hospitalizations obviously continue to climb. Last week, middle of the week, we hit our highest number of COVID patients admitted. It was 52. Again, we're currently at 45. It ebbs and flows a little bit, but continues to increase as the weeks go on. And then this just gives you a sense of our ICU capacity across the major treatment centers in Intermountain. If you look in that middle section, what you'll see is compared to where our historical census runs in our ICU units, you can see where each hospital is running relative to what we're used to. So Utah Valley's been running at about 140% of its usual occupancy. And I think the most important point that's coming out more clearly is just the understanding that having a bed does not mean you have the ability to take another patient. Our challenges really lie primarily with staffing. This is our surge plan. So when this pandemic started, we stood up a command center locally at this hospital. Intermountain Healthcare has a command center as a system. We have these surge plans for pandemics and other mass, casualty events. And this is tweaked a little bit over time, but this is how we look at things. And we have the ability to expand and grow our ICU capability into other parts of the hospital, which is what this surge plan does. If you look at that top line, we're currently starting to do that for our ICU, which is full, and we're starting to spill over into our 5th floor kind of ICU area with non-COVID patients. We've tried to aggregate these COVID patients into closed units so as not to intermix them with other medical or surgical patients that we have in the hospital. But we are starting to initiate some of the first stages of this surge plan as it relates to our ICU and expanding where we care for those patients inside the hospital. But staffing is our biggest challenge. Just to give you a snapshot, we've had 247 employees here contract COVID. 43, as best we can tell, were work exposures. The majority of those, in fact, it's probably less than 5 of those exposures were from a patient. Most of our work exposures have been caregiver to caregiver in a break room, at a nurse's station. Somebody doesn't realize and they get lax in their use of their mask. And we've had a challenge with just the vigilance in having our staff always, because they're wearing a face shield and a mask all day long, to always keep it on, even when they're chatting with a coworker. So certainly been a challenge. We currently have 67 employees or caregivers out on COVID. And daily we have anywhere from usually right around 15 nurses that are calling in sick for various reasons. there's a number of things that we're trying to do about that. I get the question a lot of, why don't you guys just hire more people? If you don't have the people to care for more patients, why don't you just simply hire more people? That's not a quick thing to do, especially if you're hiring ICU trained nurses. They don't just grow on trees, and a nurse is not just a nurse, especially when you're taking care of the sickest patients. So we are hiring. This hospital alone's actively hiring 69 different types of nursing positions, including many in the ICU. But those will take some time to get in place. I think one of the things I'd want you to understand is most hospitals do not have a staffing model that is rich enough that they can run at 100% occupancy for some extended period of time, right? We just never have to do that. We have moments where we surge and we get full in a particular area, but invariably patients get better and the volumes come down. And so our staffing models have never been created such that we would be running at 100% capacity for extended periods. And that's why we're a little bit challenged at the moment. Intermountain has secured a number of external traveler contracts where we've brought in nurses from other states. Yesterday, I had 15 traveler nurses in my hospital helping us care for patients where we didn't have enough of our own nurses. So I expect you'll see us continue to use that going forward. We're using other mechanisms like some mandatory additional shifts with incentive pay. We're asking for volunteers of nurses that are working in non-clinical roles to come back to the bedside and help out. There's a lot of coordination where we're level loading patients. If you're a patient in Heber and you need to be admitted to a higher level hospital, we have a transfer center that looks at how full our facilities are, and you may get sent to American Fork Hospital because they've got an open bed and the best potential to care for you instead of just necessarily always coming to Utah Valley. So we are coordinating that as a system and trying to level load to help with the resources. We are also still looking at surgeries. The end of the year for hospitals is always the busiest time for surgeries. People hit their deductibles and want to get that surgery done. Not sure how that's going to play out this year because so many people, when we stopped doing surgeries, weren't able to do that. Many people may not have hit a deductible this year, but we're doing our best not to impact that. The challenge we have is that some of our nursing resources that have been cross-trained to help us in the ICU and other areas, they live in these surgery in the operating rooms. And so there's two benefits to ramping surgeries down. You start to diminish the number of patients that will come on to a nursing floor, but you also free up nursing resources that can be redeployed to help you where you have the greatest need. And we certainly don't want to do that, but we are looking at if our numbers continue to rise, the need to sort of in a stepwise function bring some of that back down potentially as we head into the end of the year. Just a couple of other slides here before I wrap up. I wanted you to know there's been some really neat innovation that our teams have done through this pandemic. Obviously, very early on, we had significant challenges with supply chain and personal protective equipment, masks, gowns, all those sorts of things. We actually partnered with a local company known as Phone Soap to create a mechanism to quickly decontaminate our N95 masks of some of our caregivers right there at the nursing areas. And so this was kind of a cool, collaborative that they approached us on, and we found a way to utilize their technology for this purpose. We still had caregivers that would utilize it to, put their cell phone or keys or something in it to disinfect those things before going home as well. But we were using these products with a 10-minute turnaround time to really rapid cycle and clean the N95 masks our caregivers have been using. So that's been kind of a neat example of one innovation. And then one of our materials employees came up with a kind of a jerry-rigged way that if we started to run out of these, they're called pappers. You can see the picture on the right. Those Those are usually connected to a battery-powered belt that cycles the air and filters it and cycles it through in a positive pressure environment. We only have so many of the belts, and we were running into issues of not having enough of those. We had plenty of the face shields and masks. So one of our employees found a way to sort of connect with tubing to the oxygen supply valves we have in every room, and basically helped us overcome a challenge in having enough ways to connect employees with this positive oxygen when using a PAPR. So just some kind of neat innovations that our teams developed out of necessity as we've dealt with the challenges. I think this is my last slide. Just we've tried to be very focused in terms of community testing. We've got testing sites that we've run in fixed locations in the county at Springville, American Fork Hospital, and at Lehigh. We've also had a mobile RV testing unit that's been through the county several times. Most recently in mid-October, we did a couple of days of mobile testing at a local school, and have tried to, based on zip code data, understanding where the hot spots were and working with the local department, health departments, add supplementary testing resources as needed. We've transitioned from our model for the community testing to one that's based on symptoms, and one that requires you to sort of get in line and get an appointment before just driving up. We are testing all of our patients that have surgeries beforehand, and we've separated where those patients are getting tested. They were going to the community testing sites as well for a long time, but that's been changed, and they're now coming to the hospitals for their testing. I think in these last two mobile testing sites that we did in Provo, was sort of over UEA, that UEA week, I believe. We had about 100 tests each day. It's my recollection on the numbers for those testing sites. So we continue to utilize that mobile unit that Intermountain has to try and supplement as much as we can. And the hopes that we're getting to a point now where rapid tests will be much more available to the public, to the school, universities and others, based on commitments from the CDC. So we'll see kind of where testing goes from here. But I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to certainly answer any questions that you have and go from there.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hanson. First of all, I'm sure everyone on the council and the administration here, the mayor, we all feel so grateful to you and all of your staff and all the people on the front lines during this time. We're just very fortunate to have the resources and the people that work with you, and so please convey our gratitude. I had two quick questions. One is just some concern. You mentioned people were trying to film in the hospital. Are these people who are, worried that you're overworked, or worried that there's some sort of, misinformation campaign going on, that there's really no stresses at the hospital at all?
It's the latter. It's conspiracy theorists that believe what they're being told is not accurate, and they're determined to videotape and capture the proof of that by accessing our facility. So we've had to change some things relative to how we patrol our entrances. We still have limited visitor policy. Basically, you really can only get in if you are here for an appointment yourself, or most patients are allowed 2 visitors, usually 1 at a time. So you have to be listed in a log that we track as a designated visitor for a patient. But we've had some people get pretty creative in how they've lied about coming in for appointment or other things that we've had to change some of our processes. So unfortunately, it's the latter.
I'm very sorry to hear that. And maybe related to that, is there what can we do in the city to help you? I mean, to help educate the public, help get people, to take the health guidelines more seriously. First of all, you may have some specific things you want to say here, but I think it's always going to be the case that we would welcome your feedback on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know this is a challenging thing, and the enforcement part of anything that we think is good to do is always the question that has to be asked, because I think there's lots of good ideas and information out there, but how do you get people to do it? And when they don't do it, what do you do? Those are really tougher questions. I guess my opinion on this is that there's enough people in the community that if they hear some edict from the government, are probably going to act in opposition of that at times, just based on the source, no matter what their politics are, how they feel. I feel strongly that employers really have a great role to play in this work. The messaging that we're trying to avoid having to shut businesses down is real. But if you're a business owner and you've got difficulties running your business because you've got employees who are sick and having to quarantine and can't come to work, that's impactful too. That impacts your ability to effectively run your business. So, the city obviously is an employer. I think as much as you can continue to reiterate and get your own employees to buy into this and adhere to it and be examples of it in their circles of influence, I think that that's as much as we probably need to ask anybody that's in an employer arrangement to try and help out. I wish I had greater confidence that people listen, but we just know that's not proven to be true at this point. And so I think as employers, the more we can do and be a voice there with our employees, that's an angle to work.
Other questions from the council? We've got just about 5 minutes left. All right, seeing no further questions.
Real quick.
Oh, go ahead, Mr.
Derek,
Shipley.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The communication regarding testing has been a little bit confusing to me, and I think people that I visited with over the past months. A lot of the communication from the state seems to be that we need to increase testing and that more testing will be available, and that asymptomatic people should get tested if they've come in contact with someone that had COVID. But then many times those same people check locally and they can't get a test, or they're told not to get a test if they're asymptomatic. I was encouraged by some notes from Governor-elect Cox recently about additional rapid testing capability that might be available. I just wonder, what have you actually seen? Is our capacity really improving, or are we still working off kind of the expectation that it should improve, but we don't yet have those tests and it's not really available at this point?
Yeah, great question. Based on what I've seen, I've seen unfortunately more of the talk about the resources than I have actually an increase in the number of tests. I don't know that we're turning people away at our testing sites based on a lack of tests, but maybe for some of those other reasons, like you mentioned, whether or not they're symptomatic or not, are they qualifying to get a test done based on that. The messaging I recall hearing from the meetings the CDC and the White House coronavirus task force had with the governor and then with Utah Hospital Associations was they have these tests and they're going to ship 1 million of them to Utah. I guess I'll start to believe that when I see it come to fruition and we've got those on site in locations where they can be utilized. But the hospital itself has access to a very small number of rapid tests that we are utilizing to test certain patients that come in through our ER to quickly know with a 1 hour, 2 hour turnaround time, is this a COVID patient or not? Because they've got to go up to the ICU, they've got to go to the operating room. We've got to know, so those teams know whether they've got to gown up in a certain way or not. And we've struggled to get greater access to that quick, rapid turnaround type of test during this entire pandemic. So unfortunately, I guess my experience has been there's been a lot of promise and talk, and I haven't seen a lot of that yet come to fruition. I guess I'm hopeful that maybe there is something more out there that's on its way, but for the rapid tests, I haven't seen a ton of it yet.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hansen, for visiting with us personally. My son Spencer, who works for IC, certainly speaks highly of you. My interest today is in the vaccine potential. Pfizer, of course, has hit the papers this week. Everyone is excited about that. Of course, we've all thought that vaccines of various kinds maybe are the cure-all ultimately for this thing. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So just in the last 2 weeks, we have been working closely with our system leaders to create a process for how we will roll a vaccine out at the hospital. We're listed as sort of phase 1A of the areas where the first doses of vaccine would be available for high-risk caregivers to access, probably 1,000 doses initially that would come to this hospital. They obviously can't commit as to when that will be. There's some special requirements that we're hearing most of the vaccine makers will likely have, which include like a negative 80-degree freezer, which we don't have a lot of those just sitting around the hospital to store 1,000 vials worth of vaccine. So there's some things we need to get in place that we're working on now, with the understanding that we could potentially have, if FDA clearance comes and the safety data looks good enough, the first rollout of phase 1A of a vaccine for healthcare workers before the end of the year. So we're getting ready for that, knowing that whether or not that timing happens or not is certainly not up to us. We won't force our employees to get this vaccine. It's a novel vaccine without long-term safety data available. We will make it available to those, but unlike the flu vaccine, which we require, we wouldn't force it upon our caregivers. Most of these vaccines will have a secondary dose, a booster that you have to take a few weeks later. So we right now are just working on a process with the understanding, based on what the CDC is telling us, that we should be ready potentially by December to administer vaccine in the early phases to healthcare workers. How that rolls out to the general public, to at-risk patients in nursing homes, other places, I'm less informed on, probably shouldn't speak to, but I guess would assume that, within some number of months, you would expect to see it getting to the general public based on how fast they can produce. So that's what I know at this point.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hansen. Again, please convey our gratitude to everyone associated with you, and we appreciate your time and appreciate this important update. We are with you in solidarity and an appreciation for all that you're doing.
Excellent. Thanks for the support.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll move on then to item number 3, which is a presentation on Carterville Parking Permit Program presented by Javin Weaver, our planner. This item has 20 minutes. We're a little bit behind, so hopefully we can make up a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. John, can you pull up my PowerPoint, please? All right. I'm going to go just back one slide to the overview, please. A couple slides. Next one down. Perfect, thank you. 3 citizens requested that the University Gardens, Carterville, and Slate Canyon areas be analyzed for a parking permit. Staff went out multiple times to count vehicle counts at various times throughout the day, late night hours as well, early morning hours, to gather data, various days, whether it would be weekdays or weekends. Staff also went and counted how many legal parking spaces are within each of these areas along the roadway, measuring out what's considered a legal spot. You can scroll down to the Carterville slide, please. Thank you. Mary Gale was the applicant for this. Some of the goals that she wanted to have was to preserve, actually, let me backtrack, I apologize. Let me orient you with where you're at. This is Carterville Neighborhood. You have 300 west going northward towards 1625 north. This also includes 1300 north, 1500 north, and 380 west. So we're directly just east of Maeser Shopping Center, north of the hospital, and west of Alpine Village. Some of the goals for that Ms. Gale had was to preserve on-street parking for residents within this area and their guests. Permits would be for both sides of the street from the hours of 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Monday through Saturday. Any other time would be no permit would be required. Residents would get 2 permits per dwelling. Cost of a permit would be between $50 to $100. Next slide, please. Location of this is pretty good due to the arterial roads acting as a boundary. 1625 North is the most heavily street utilized for parking for vehicles on it. Other streets are less utilized for parking. The cost of the permit does not cover the operating cost to administer. While staff was analyzing this area, we realized that Paul Ream Avenue was not being utilized to its fullest. To remind you of where Paul Ream is, this is between University Avenue and 200 West, about 1525 North, essentially. Currently, there was a time restriction along the street, either 2 hours or half an hour. That has now been changed, and so there's no time restriction along that corridor to allow for parking for those complexes to park along there. Since the change has been done with that street, the data is still alike as when the time restriction was occurring. So staff analyzed the area prior to the restriction and after the restriction, and the number of vehicles parking within Carterville neighborhood has not really changed. Staff believes that the applicant's proposal is unnecessary to the utilization of the streets in the neighborhood, and staff recommends to not adopt the Carterville permit proposal. Does council have any questions?
Thank you. Ms. Ellsworth, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm reading in in the report, right, and it talks about, trying to find the page. Let's see, the goals on page 3. It says residents have seen people living in nearby apartment buildings park their cars on these streets and leave them for multiple days. This program aims to limit that from happening. We already have laws that prohibit people from parking for more than 72 hours on a street, right? Without moving their car, 400 feet?
Correct.
So,
they just have to move their car every 72 hours.
Okay. So it just seems like it's more of an enforcement issue than a true parking problem. Would you agree?
Enforcement does look at this area fairly regularly. They just did it this previous week and only saw with the number of vehicles that could park. Example, on 1625 North, I want to say there's about 29 vehicles that can legally park there, and only, I want to say no more than 2, maybe 3, were there longer than 72 hours. So they are moving.
Okay, gotcha. So if there's 2 or 3 cars that are parked there for multiple days, does that justify a parking permit program?
Staff doesn't believe that it does, but that's up to council's decision.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that it does.
Ms. Gale did have the concern about vehicles being parked in the neighborhood that in the middle of the night car alarms go off, and it's hard to identify who that person is because theoretically, if a student was parking there, they live over at Alpine Village, there's really no way of her being able to contact that individual person. I do understand that concern, but that would be working with the police department to help with that, with those car alarms, is my understanding, at least.
Do car alarms go off a lot? I mean, in my neighborhood, they don't.
I'm not 100% sure on what she would say on that, but she
Okay.
did express that concern at least.
All right, I understand. Thank you, Javin.
Javin, I've got a couple of questions. You mentioned the possibility of shared parking, exploring that option. You also mentioned maybe even an overall, I wasn't sure if it was an overall policy recommendation that we ought to at least look at the fee that we typically charge for parking permit programs. Do you want to comment on either of those?
Well, if there's shared parking agreement was to be done, that would be done third-party wise through the owners of the businesses nearby. There are commercial businesses along Paul Ream Avenue and 200 West that after 5 p.m. those areas are vacant, more or less. And if they wanted to go into that would be something they would need to work out, I would believe, privately between them. But the $15 fee that we have for residential permits, that doesn't cover what it requires to administer a parking residential permit program. So I mean, that could be increased, but that would be up to council's decision.
And if you've spoken with the Gales, I just haven't heard anything more recently from them. And I was very concerned about the sort of unlivable circumstances they seem to be in at different points. And so I just want to make sure that they're, whatever we do does actually solve their problem specifically, even if we don't feel like it ends up being necessary to institute a formal parking permit program. I don't want to just say no to that and then kind of leave that problem hanging.
I have not spoken with her since then, since that email chain initially. When we initially were gathering the data, we gathered data in December before BOU ended. We gathered data during the break, gathered data when they came back, gathered data after the changes on Paul Ream, and then gathered data this fall to see how things have changed. And pretty much the number of vehicles parking on 1625 North specifically, that number has not changed, regardless of the changes that we did on Paul Ream.
Thank you. Mr. Sewell? Oops, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I was just trying to review this document here. I can't remember, does it state in here what percentage of the 93 affected properties are in support of this proposal?
I cannot recall off the top of my head. I apologize.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Harding?
Thank you. I noticed that Mr. Weaver's opening slide showed all 3 parking permit programs that we'll be getting a report on today. I do have some thoughts about parking permit programs generally. It may make more sense, though, for me to share those after we've touched on all 3. But I am very interested in the idea of shared parking. I think it's an idea that we definitely should be looking at and potentially making changes to our code. But my understanding is that basically affects the parking minimums that are required to be built at the time that a development gets built. And I guess also technically we require all properties, rentals as well as owner occupant properties, to have as many off-street parking stalls as cars are operated from the property. So I guess that would affect that as well. But we are not too active in keeping that actively enforced. So that the problem with people parking on the street right now, I don't believe that our code that does not allow parking sharing to go into what the minimum is required for off-street to be built with each project. I don't think that's necessarily keeping people from letting people share their parking lot or entering into, agreements to rent basically spaces in those parking lots after hours. So just changing that code, I don't think is going to necessarily alleviate this problem. Generally, there's no impetus, there's no reason for a business owner to offer a parking lot if no one's willing to pay for it. And generally, people aren't willing to pay for that parking until there is a cost to park on street. And once there's a cost to park on street, then you start opening opportunities for parking lot sharing to begin to make sense.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Weaver? All right, thank you so much. We'll move on then to, we'll of course be revisiting this item later this evening. We'll move on to item number 4 on our agenda, which is also going to be presented by Mr. Weaver. This is a presentation permit proposal. We also have 20 minutes for this item.
All right, thank you. To orient you with where we're at, this is Slate Canyon. Hannah Peterson was the applicant for this proposal, and the map is north is going to be pointing towards the left side of the screen. Initially, their proposal was for Slate Canyon Drive for the entire corridor, starting from where 350 East is at that roundabout, ending at State Street down by the 7-Eleven, and slightly including some of the spurs of Nevada Ave and a couple other public streets just adjacent to Slate Canyon. But their proposal, they were wanting to have unrestricted time from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. and then have a restricted permit along that corridor from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. Number of permits will be given based on street frontage. They have a concern with RVs and vehicles being stationary on the roadway, extending their 72 hours. Some of the goals that the applicant had were to reduce parking congestion and to reduce the need for zoning enforcement within this area. In addition to the analysis that staff did for counting how many vehicles are on the corridor, as well as how many legal parking spaces is, staff went along the corridor and observed when people would park a vehicle, where they would go to, where they would travel to after they exited their car, whether they would be going into the HOAs to the east side of this corridor, or if they were going to dwellings along Slate Canyon area. Next slide, please. So like I said, staff analyzed this section, this corridor in various sections. No section was 100% occupied at any given time throughout the day, morning, night, late night, etc. Also, during the analysis, staff did see the need to increase or to add no parking signs by fire hydrants while conducting the study. We discovered that there were, to improve the safety of this area, that was something that needed to happen. One concern that the applicant had was speeding along the corridor. If speeding is happening along here, and that could be due to the design of the street and maybe a lack of enforcement. Vehicles are only occupying the street at about 51% throughout the entire corridor. There's still a lot of parking along the corridor. Permit cost for this would be $15, which that doesn't cover the cost to administer and enforce. Between 1997 to 2019, there were 95 code enforcement cases along this corridor, and 95 cases, and about half of those were for occupancy. Staff doesn't believe that the applicant's proposal will accomplish what is the desired outcome. Staff does recommend, however, that 2-hour parking be installed along this corridor from Aspen Lane to about 1450 South. And this would be from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Part of our thought process on this is this would help with occupancy issues. If you have a home with 3 occupants, you could utilize the driveway, you could utilize the garage. If you had more occupants and it'd be harder to utilize your driveway, use your off-street available options for it. Or if you had, another example, if you had a home with, again, 2 in the garage, 2 on the driveway, and you had a RV or something like that, you'll be able to park the RV on your property, park your vehicles on your off-street on your parking spots. Or if you got home from work, got home by 4 o'clock, you would still park on the street in front of your property. This would also help to improve the safety of it and see vehicles not be so stationary along the street. Staff feels like this would help accomplish some of the goals that the applicant had overall. However, staff does recommend that council not adopt the applicant's Slate Canyon Drive permit proposal. Are there any questions for staff?
Sorry, I was having a little bit of a technical difficulty. There are 2 hands raised. Go ahead, Mr. Fillmore. I think you must be muted.
Gavin, let me begin with this. I have a family who lives on Slate Canyon Drive, and they've been there for quite a few years. And the 51% utilization rate, if I understand correctly, that pertains to parking on the street. Is that right?
Correct.
That number seems woefully low to me. Every time I go to visit, I have a hard time finding a place to park just to visit my son and his family. At what time of day is that utilization rate measured?
This is an average for the entire corridor. By corridor, I'm meaning from Aspen Lane down to about 14th South. And these were done at all hours of the day and also at the night.
Okay. I mean, as you are well aware, there's a huge parking and safety issue on that street. What we have there is a lot of young families, a lot of little kids and children. And when you have the vehicles parked bumper to bumper on both sides of the street and cars speeding by, it's a terribly high hazard. I'm personally aware of a handful of children that almost got hit just in the past year. Something's got to be done there, Gavin. I mean, this is a huge safety issue. And my friends and relatives on that street tell me that this is the single most contentious issue in that neighborhood, is parking and speeding on Slate Canyon Drive. And, you know, you've got all kinds of trade-offs. People trying to be nice to everybody, but the fact is that children are at risk, and parking is really a mess. If you go further east, of course, we're talking about Ellsworthville, and it's not quite as intense there. But on Slate Canyon Drive, it's a very intense problem. Is there any way we can slow down that traffic, speed bumps or something to make that? I mean, it's really not, it's being used as a thoroughfare, but it's really in the middle of a very highly populated neighborhood.
That couple of things. First, with the 51%, if I broke this up into 4 different sections, some of the sections were higher than this 51%. So I agree. As you go to certain areas, that number is higher, but overall, it does come to that number. I know that the applicant worked diligently with the neighborhood on listening and getting opinions and views and everything with that to try to come up with the best proposal. If speeding is happening along here, that's going to be an enforcement issue and also design issue. Definitely, I'm sure Public Works would be open to, and hopefully open to, making adjustments and changes to improve the safety of this corridor for the residents of in this area.
Is that a city-owned street?
I'm sorry?
Is that a city-owned street?
Yes, it is.
No, it's not state, or okay.
No.
So what is the feasibility of something like speed bumps? I mean, a more drastic 24/7 approach to slowing down traffic. Because sporadic enforcement isn't going to do it. They've tried that off and on for 20 years.
And you know, one additional thing, between the roundabout 350 East till you hit State Street, there are no stop signs for that entire street. It is a collector. However, there's no built-in mechanism to really slow down at all throughout it, as I'm sure it counts. Ms. Ellsworth is very aware of.
So what suggestions do you have, Gavin, to slow down traffic?
My suggestion would be to talk with Public Works on that, because that is within their parameters of it. They are the experts on that. I made thoughts on it. I mean, it's in some ways having the street has parked cars on the side, has bicycle lanes on each side. So already the street's somewhat narrow just based on the amount of that you view as you're driving the corridor, but it is still an easy street to increase your speed on. Additionally, it's a sloped street. Another easy way to increase your speed, maybe without realizing it far too often.
Right. Now, apparently your staff recommendation was negative on this parking plan. Do you have ideas for how to improve that parking plan, or is this just an outright rejection and move on to the next issue?
This is a recommendation to not go for what the applicant did. If we were to do anything, I think initially it would be to do the time restriction along that corridor. That would also help with, again, occupancy. And really, in looking at this corridor, a lot of the garages in this area are full of items and are not being able to be utilized for off-street parking for vehicles. And so there's that's very high in this area, I feel like. And if people were able to utilize what they are, what their homes have already provided, what the code already allows based on the 2-car garages and having 2 legal spots in front of it, there may not be such a demand for off-street or for on-street parking.
Well, I guess what I'm leading up to is, instead of just rejecting this parking plan out of hand, you'd be willing to work with that neighborhood to come up with a better parking plan?
Staff's open to working with Shannon Peterson on this. Definitely work, happy to converse with her further.
Hold up. Bill, let me explain a couple of things if that's okay.
Please.
I live here and I use that road every single day. I can't leave my neighborhood without using Slate Canyon Drive, so I'm very familiar with it. A couple of things. This proposal came forward as a way to control occupancy in the area, but in the almost 5 years I've lived here, I've only known one building that's overoccupied, one unit that's overoccupied. So if we do want to go after occupancy, I don't think parking is the way to do it, nor do I believe that occupancy is an issue in this area. Additionally, the applicant lives a mile away. The applicant doesn't live up here. So I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who do live here, people who live in the 3 HOAs, from the HOA managers, the HOA boards. I talked to a neighbor who lives on Slate Canyon Drive, who's lived there for 20 plus years this morning. And they said they really don't want a parking permit program. They said there might be a handful of people that are in favor of it, like 8 people might be in favor of it. But this person said generally people don't want this parking permit program. As Javin mentioned, and as I can attest to, a lot of folks on Slate Canyon Drive use their garage not for vehicle storage, but for kind of an extra attic to store household items or extra furniture or kayaks and things like that. So I think it's just a lifestyle choice that people choose to park on the street, or they choose to park in their driveway, or they choose to park in their driveway and on the street. Additionally, there are a number of RVs or boats or camper vans or broken down cars that are permanently on the street for months and months at a time. So my hope is that we would just see better parking enforcement, better code enforcement. And I understand that those staffs are usually understaffed and that it does take a lot of resources, but I feel like that would be the best first step to managing some of the parking that exists here. And we're never going to be able to tell people like, oh, you have to get all that stuff out of your garage and you have to put your car in your garage. That's not necessarily our role. But if we did get a little bit more enforcement on cars that I say are perma parked, I think that would help. And to your point about About safety, I 1000% agree, because I was in a car accident here on Slate Canyon Drive a few years ago, with ongoing health problems after that car accident. So I care a lot about safety. I hate that people speed on Slate Canyon Drive, but the speeds on Slate Canyon Drive are because of the way the road is designed. It's a very wide road, and especially on the north side by the state hospital and on the south side kind of by the 7-Eleven. They're very wide roads, and there's nothing to indicate to a driver that they need to slow down or that they should slow down or that there's consequences for speeding. Because once you get to the top, there's cars on both sides of the road, so it feels narrower, and there's less margin for error as a driver, whether you're looking at your phone or whether you're speeding. So you naturally slow down on a narrower road, or a road that feels narrower. So at the top of Slate Canyon, those are some of the slower speeds for Slate Canyon Drive, because the road does feel narrower. If we had $1 billion, I wish that we could redesign that road and make the sidewalks wider and create park strips, put sidewalks on both sides, put park strips in, expand the bike lanes, and redesign that road so that it wasn't natural to drive so fast. But yeah, I think we should discuss with Public Works how we're going to manage a road that's almost 2 miles long, that has no stop signs, no stoplights, no speed bumps, and that is designed for speed. The friend I talked to this morning, the neighbor who lives out on Slate Canyon Drive, she said she just calls it a racetrack. And I know it because I know people speed out there, and they come up right behind me when I drive the speed limit, and I always drive the speed limit. And they're impatient, and occasionally people will pass me. And it's really frustrating. It's really not safe. And when you've had the experiences that I've had being in a car accident and worrying about kids out there in the front yard and on the sidewalks, it's not a safe road. And it comes down to the design of that road. So I think that's something we should dig into with Public Works so that we can improve that. Because it's definitely about safety. The parking is really about enforcement, but the speeding comes down to the way the road was designed. So hopefully that's helpful.
No, very helpful. Let me summarize what I hear you saying. First is that neither you nor a majority of those neighbors really want a parking program, but you would want better enforcement if we can coax that out of the administration. Secondly, that you view it like I do, mostly as a safety problem. We ought to be talking to Dave Decker and the city engineer to see what they could do to slow down traffic.
Absolutely.
So let's work on that, you and me.
Okay. Yeah, I think the safety is more an issue of speed than necessarily all the cars on the side of the road. So.
But the problem with the cars on the side of the road is that little kids dart in between them.
The visibility, absolutely.
Yeah, and so they do kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Good. I'll follow up with you.
I remember when I was learning to drive in our neighborhood in South Jordan, my dad said if you have to drive between 2 cars on each side of the road, you have to go extra slow, because if a kid jumps out, you can't swerve. And that's a situation that we have on Slate Canyon. So we really need to slow speeds, and I'm 1000% in favor of that.
Good. Okay, thank you, Javin.
Thanks. I fully agree with some of the things that have been said. I think that if we were to remove all on-street parking along Slate Canyon, you'd find an increase in speed, not a decrease in speed. I think if there was a modest decrease in on-street parking, if on-street parking was cut in half or whatever, I don't think it would affect the speed one way or another. There would still be a speeding problem, but it wouldn't increase it or decrease it. But it would increase the safety a bit, just as what was discussed, where you wouldn't have a solid wall of cars. It'd be a little bit easier to notice that kids are at play and are more likely to see them if a child were to dart out. So there would be a small increase in safety. In talking about the garages, what we have a situation here, it is more convenient to park your car generally in a garage than out on the street. But right now, on-street parking is free. And if you were to go get a storage unit somewhere, that would be fairly costly. And so someone can say, well, instead of parking in the garage, I'll just park out here. It's still free, and then I can use the space that would be for my garage for my stuff. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, if someone makes that choice. That the problem generally, and I think this is getting a little bit into what I want to talk just broadly about all permit programs later, but generally the problem is that we are providing a kind of a community asset for free, something that costs the public money, and then we're offering it for free. And so that is going to change people's judgments and what they choose to do with their money and their time and their space and their things. And so we are, I think, distorting that a little bit, and so we just need to be aware that that's what, we call it free parking, but there are costs to that free parking. The other thing I wanted to talk about is enforcement. Some of this discussion back and forth in Southeast Provo, particularly along the street, has been going on longer than I've been on the council. And particularly when we talk about over occupancy and whatnot, and there's been so much said over the years. I don't live in this area. I care about the health of Provo, globally, which means I have to care about the health of Provo in every location. If I could just wave my magic wand, it would be that everyone would choose to follow the law, and then perhaps some of the contention would decrease. But for a long time, when we were being asked to enforce our laws regarding occupancy, a lot of people said, well, what's the problem? What's the problem with over occupancy? Why do we care at all? And people would say, well, it affects this and this and this. And one of those things was parking. We've got this parking congestion problem. And people would say, well, if that's the problem, if that's what you care about, why don't you enforce on that? Why don't you enforce on parking? And so now we have a request to manage parking. And I've heard from a few now that says, well, let's if the problem's over occupancy, well, then just enforce on over occupancy. Don't mess with parking. So there with enforcement, just broadly, particularly with parking, there's certain things that are fairly easy to do, and there's certain things that are more difficult to do. It's a bit more difficult to enforce on a 72-hour limit. It's to catch someone that's just over 72 hours, you kind of have to catch them just when they first park and catch them just before they leave. It also requires coming back twice. Same thing even with a 2-hour limit, where in order to give anyone a ticket, you might drive down that street, someone might be there for 12 hours. But that first time, you can't do anything. You have to come back that second time, somewhere around 2 hours later, and then you only catch those who happen to bridge those 2 hours, which I assume, and then even more so for that 72, which I assume is the reason why people are complaining that there's been boats there for weeks. And it's just because, in part, because enforcement is difficult, in part because we have limited resources. If our parking permit programs are costing $15 a permit, that doesn't give us a lot of resources to provide enough enforcement. Certain things like, for example, if just in this case, if there was an overnight ban unless you have a permit, now enforcement just has to drive through once, and everyone who is parked on the street and doesn't have a permit can be enforced upon right away. And so there's certain setups that are easier to enforce, and I do think we need to be listening to staff and listening to the parking enforcement people, and just cognizant that some enforcement's easier said than done, and some enforcement's easier than others. So anyway, my thoughts on that.
Go ahead, if we need to move on though.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate Mr. Harding's comments. I would just add that occupancy just is not an issue in these 3 HOAs or on Slate Canyon Drive. It's just not anymore. It might have been 4 or 5 years ago, but it's just not today. That most of this area is in my congregation, and it's just, people just don't over occupy up here. And so I feel like that's a red herring if that was part of the initial argument. And it also makes it a little awkward that the applicant, doesn't live up here. And then just during this conversation, I've gotten 2 messages from people who do live here talking about enforcement of the 72-hour law would really help. There are trailers, boats, etc., that sit there way beyond the 72-hour limit. Let's see. I'll also bet that more than 50% of the homes could not park a car in their garage because it's used for other things. Speeding is the problem. So yeah, I think if we could address speeding and enforce the laws that we have on the books, that would be ideal.
Thank you. I wanted to just, I misunderstood something about our agenda that regarding our previous item and this item and subsequent items. These are not coming back for tonight. So I should have actually made sure we were entirely clear on the last item and on this one, what instructions we're giving Mr. Weaver. And if I could just go back to the previous item for just a moment. Mr. Weaver, I would be happy to meet with the Gales with you if that would be helpful. I just want to make sure that we don't leave them hanging. I'm willing to bet that actually probably right now, given the governor's order, but certainly by Thanksgiving, whatever parking problems they've been experiencing will probably go away for a couple of months. But I just want to make sure that we have the ability to enforce that 72-hour limit. I don't want to just say that's what we're going to do, and then they find that the city's kind of slow in response to that need. So I just want to make sure that they're happy and understand with what we've decided and understand what we're doing to address that problem. So I'd be happy to follow up with you on that. I don't know if there are any other instructions that the rest of the council wanted to give on the previous item, but that was just one thing I wanted to mention. And then with regard to this item, just very briefly, I would just say 1450 East in my neighborhood has these very same problems that Slate Canyon Drive. I'm very familiar with both roads, having lived quite close to both of them. They were not built. They were built for speed and quick access, and that's created all kinds of problems. So whatever solutions we can come up with there might be useful at 1450 East as well. So any other final instructions on this? Otherwise, we'll move on then to item number 5, which is, again, Mr. Weaver talking about another parking permit proposal in University Gardens.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Haney, I got a question really for Brian Jones to answer this, but the 3 parking permit issues, do we need a motion to bring them to a council, to a regular meeting to make a final decision, or is there the ability to say we're not proceeding with it, tabling it or whatever at this point?
Let me, that code section's been revised a couple times recently. So before I answer that, let me read it real quick while Javin is presenting, and I'll answer that question after he's done.
I would imagine, Mr. Jones, that if the staff recommendation is to not approve the permit, maybe it would be different if they were recommending that we would approve it. But anyway, just keep that in mind if that
it's
helps.
A fairly convoluted process, so let me just double check and I'll confirm for you in a second.
Thank you. All right, so Ms. Ellsworth, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I just don't know. Yeah, I don't know what we're doing on these 2 parking permit proposal programs, but for the 2 previous ones we just discussed, my hope is that we would just work towards enforcement solutions and not create a program.
Okay. Let's wait for Brian's answer and then come back to it and deal with all 3 of them at that point.
Okay. All right, Mr. Weaver, go ahead.
So currently, the map on the right shows the existing parking permit that we have for the University Gardens neighborhood in that shaded orange color. The applicant's proposal is to extend that permit area along 820 North between 900 East and about 1050 East, give or take. To familiarize yourself with this, the parking lot on the south side of that corner of 820 North is part of an LDS church. North of it, we have, there are some condos, a power substation, and I believe BYU's botany facilities are right there. Reasons that Mr. Barfus would like this proposal, it's to protect overnight parking on 820 North in this area that's being discussed for residents. I believe there are only 4 or 5 residential dwellings along this street that are not included in the existing permit program, and that's what's up for discussion. This expansion would include both sides of the street. It would be the same hours as the existing permit program between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. With the same restrictions as the existing permit program. This is to prevent students from parking in this area in the nearby apartment complexes. The cost of this would be the same as current residential permits at $15. Next slide, please. Staff observed along this street of 820 North that there are still vacant spots on this area. The residential permit fee does not cover the cost of operating. Additionally, the nearby apartment complexes, the parking is not being fully utilized by its occupants. There are still vacancies within that. Staff recommends that recommends the council to not adopt the University Garden permit expansion proposal.
All right, thank you, Mr. Weaver. Questions on this item? Mr. Harding?
If no one has comments specifically on this, there were some thoughts generally about parking permit programs that I'd like to mention. I don't know if someone wants to ask questions first or if Brian has the answer.
Yeah, I'm ready. Although I have a preliminary question.
Go ahead.
So the first step of the process is for an application to be submitted and for the council to hold a public meeting, which may be a work session, to consider the level of public interest. And then they may direct a study of the proposed permit parking area to be undertaken. Are we at that step, or is this the report after the study has been undertaken?
This is the report after the study's been undertaken.
Okay, so step 2 is to receive the report. Step 3 says that within 90 days after receiving the report, the council shall hold a public hearing to consider whether or not to consider a resolution of intent. So the next step is automatic. That the step after you receive the report is to hold the public hearing to determine whether to proceed at that point. So that's going to be a future evening meeting agenda item, but I don't believe it's been scheduled yet.
Correct. I think,
and you have 90 days from today to do that.
Mr. Harding?
Thank you. And I'm definitely open to discussion on this. I think my preference, though, might be to take maybe even most of those 90 days before we actually bring it to a meeting. Just I'm on 2 different committees: the downtown parking committee as well as the walking neighborhood parking committee, and we are, even though we've been quiet for a bit, we have been making a lot of progress in the background, and I think we're about ready to start sharing some things with other counselors and kind of re-engaging there. So and I'm hoping that some of the things we're talking about might apply to these areas. And if I may, let me just share some broad thoughts on parking permit programs. I have mixed feelings. So let me make a case for why, kind of against parking permit programs. You think that the street is public space and comes with public cost. We pay public money, taxpayer money, to pave the shoulder of roads. We use public money to maintain these, to repave when necessary. Some of these we pay to keep clear of snow. It may not be as often as some may like, but we clean the roads as well. So this is public space. We're putting public money into it, and parking permit programs, particularly as they are proposed, and I think we've often we don't put them in place exactly as they're proposed, but generally, some of them have even said, like, I want the spot out in front of my house to only be for me. Only me and my guests, the people I want, should be the only ones that can park out in front of my house. But even some of the others where it's like, okay, only residents of this neighborhood can park here. So we're taking a public resource, we're putting public money into maintaining it, and then we're turning around and putting public money, particularly when these fees, when the permit fees are far less than the cost to administer the program. We're basically taking more taxpayer money to enforce the exclusive use of this public resource to a subset of people, and that just seems very wrong on a lot of levels. So generally, I'm thinking, particularly at the traditional permit program, seems wrong on a lot of levels. But then let me argue from the other side, though. Public on-street parking is a great convenience, and it's a great way of sharing space. So instead of having to have a stall for every person who might possibly visit at peak time, we can have this public space that anyone can use, and as the needs ebb and flow, people can come park, and maybe your visitors usually just one or two cars in a typical month or whatever, but maybe you have a birthday party and you have 12 cars come over, and it's great because we don't need to provide parking for 12 people at every single property. We can have this expandable, shareable space. On-street parking is very convenient for a lot of those reasons. The problem is when the demand gets so high that those conveniences break down, where you rely on the street to park, and you can't park within blocks of your house. So things really start breaking down, and so again, it's this kind of it's a commons. It's this public space that can work very well when everyone uses it just a little bit and doesn't overuse it, doesn't abuse it. The problem is with it being a free resource, the kind of tragedy of the commons. If you get someone that's putting in a new apartment building, or maybe the amount of cars that a typical person has, particularly if they're going to college, has changed over the years. And so you have an apartment building. Now technically that apartment building should provide enough off-street parking for every car that's operated from there, but that's really costly. And so someone, as long as they're willing to ignore that requirement, then they can tell people, oh, well, we don't have enough spots for you off street, but hey, you can just park out on the street. And so things are either developed or things evolve, and there's tens of thousands of dollars of incentive to just use the street. And so I'm very sympathetic to someone who wants to be able to have their father come and visit their grandkids or their kids. I'm very cognizant of that and very sympathetic to that, where all the on-street parking is filled, and that's it's a quality of life issue. It's when you're trying to take your cans out to the street and you have to fight, and you don't have space to even put your cans out onto the street because this is being abused. And so from that perspective, I think parking permit programs make a lot of sense. And so so I can see things from both sides. I think that what's really interesting now is we have technological options that we haven't had in the past, and I think a well-designed program can add a cost to parking on the street, and then people can make that decision. Do I want to pay the cost to park on the street, or do I want to clear out the debris in my garage so I can park in there? And with setting the price, depending on what the demand is for that resource, we can cause people to make optimized decisions that then allows us to have this convenient service and not have it overused to the point that it's not convenient to anyone. So from that perspective, I look at some of these proposals and the ones that are saying, well, hey, I want it for $15 and I want 18, visitor parking spaces or parking passes a year and all of that. I think that's too demanding. But if the people that live there are frustrated that they don't have this convenient service and they're willing to pay some for that, then I think that's something we should look at. And that might be as simple as putting in signs that say that it costs to park here, and that cost might even be just 25 cents overnight. But you put a cost to it, and now people can decide whether or not it makes sense. And we now start making it viable for private parking lot owners to start offering and say, well, hey, for $10 a month, you can park overnight in my lot. That the problem right now is just not providing that free parking. That's not really free, and we're subsidizing it. So I guess my thought on this is I would love to hold off for some time, not make the decision now. We have to hold a hearing, nothing's scheduled, but let's schedule it out a little bit so we can finish up our work on these committees, or at least get some of these ideas out and see where that leads us and in 2 to 3 months from now.
Mr. Sewell, we're out of time. Go ahead, Mr. Sewell.
Quick process question. When Mr. Jones was describing the steps, wasn't part of the report supposed to be ascertaining the level of public interest or something along that line? I don't have a good sense of that, just from what we've heard today. I mean, we've heard the drawbacks certainly, but I don't have a good sense of whether there's just a minority of residents in the affected area that really want this, or whether there's a solid majority that really feel like it would be helpful. Is there any way we could get a little more clarity on that?
I think that's certainly something that would be appropriate to be gathered in preparation for the public hearing to be held later. It's not one of the elements that's required to be in the study or in the report, because the study is more logistical in nature. And then following the gathering of the report on the study, then you have the public hearing to consider whether to implement, and obviously that would be influenced by public opinion. At this point in time in the process, the only thing that the ordinance says about level of public interest was back in the previous public meeting that led to even asking for the study.
So, yeah, I think we can work with Mr. Weaver to schedule hearings on this item, I guess before the deadline, 90 days, sometime before the end of January, I guess. Was that what we were thinking? Anyway, so we can look forward to that opportunity. If there are no other comments on this particular item, then we will turn to item number 6, which is a discussion regarding the renewal of the Urban Deer Program. And thank you, Mr. Weaver. And we will be, I think our staff will reach out and we'll figure out that next step. So, and this will be presented, item number 6 will be presented by Camille Williams, our Deputy City Attorney. Thank you for being with us.
I'm actually a senior city attorney, not the deputy, but Joan was going to help me with the PowerPoint. Thank you. I'm going to do a quick review and try to answer some of the questions that were asked. Can you hear me all right? Okay, I think we'd agree that deer are a mixed blessing. Could you go to the next slide, please? Sometimes we think that what happened was we moved into an established habitat and drove the deer out or caused them problems. And yet there is some evidence that from explorers' descriptions in Utah that the deer populations were actually fewer and occupied less habitat than today. Next slide. Business and residential development have allowed deer in some instances to have an increase in food sources, though it's not necessarily food that's particularly good for them. And we've cut down on the number of predators, including human hunters, since within the city, hunting is disallowed except depredation hunting in agricultural areas, and then an urban deer control program. Next slide. So the result is you have fewer predators, an abundance of food, and that equals permanent resident deer. Fawns born within the city habituate, and deer have a great fidelity to where they grew up, so they're very reluctant to move. Next slide. We tend to have love-hate relationship ranging from the Bambi syndrome to the rats with horns. And the rats with horns syndrome essentially was the driver of the initial certificate of registration. I live in Provo and I seldom see a deer. I probably don't see 2 deer a year, and they're not specifically on my property. I have friends on the east side of town who at times cannot use their yards because, or at least not use them without raking up all the scat, or have had deer rutting or living in their yards. So I don't have a daily problem. Many people do. Next slide. The driving factors tend to be an overabundance of deer and that are exceeding the biological carrying capacity or the cultural carrying capacity. We have had some reports that deer within the city are actually poorer. They don't weigh as much. They don't grow as they would if they were in their natural habitat. But we don't have a biologist to study it in detail. The cultural carrying capacity, though, I think is significant. We've moved up to the 2013 dollars from a study done by a USU student for a master's degree, where in that study it indicated insurance costs are about $51.63 per collision in 2013 dollars. Presumably it would be higher today. In some areas, not in Utah so much, you have disease transmission. Certainly we have landscape garden damage. We have the loss of quiet enjoyment. Next slide. Urban deer have different characteristics. They become habituated to humans. They are risk takers in the sense they'll cross roads without understanding traffic, try to jump fences, impale themselves, get their heads stuck in fences, and then in thrashing about may break their own necks. They have a higher reproductive capacity in the city, tend to have more twins and triplets. They have reduced wariness and lack of predators. All of that contributes to an abundance of deer. Next slide. This gives us an idea of reproduction levels. The mule deer are you can have one male who will have a harem, basically. You would note that twin births are common. The chart about exponential deer growth actually factors in a mortality factor. If you don't factor in the mortality factor, then you'll be more likely to have something more akin to a J curve. And there tends to be a high fertility rate among well-fed does. Next slide. This is a heat map of all incidents and collisions. So going from cold or blue, those are the fewer incidents, to the hot or red are many incidents. Next slide. The number of deer call-outs and number of deer killed in traffic. So the total incidents in 2017, 319, 147 in 2018, 232 in 2019, 177 in 2020 to date. The number killed in traffic, as you can see, it's been a bit up and down. 2020 deserves a little bit of exploration. One of the things, of course, is that the traffic count went down considerably from what it was previously. You have a high traffic count in end of 2017 into 2018 of about 35,000 trips a day. That's reduced down to 18,000 in 2020 during the pandemic period, essentially. And then it started to go up again. So it in October, it was about 27,000 trips per day. Next slide. What we assume may have happened with the up and down is that it may be a combination of the changing traffic patterns and perhaps the change in population patterns of the deer. The carrying capacity, and this would be the biological carrying capacity, and we haven't got all the variables listed here by any means, but it's possible we could have had a population explosion, but that's going to be tempered either by a problem with habitat, which could cause a crash in theory. And if we were to talk about a more natural system, we'd probably have a couple of S curves graphed one upon the other as predator population goes up, deer capacity population goes down, and vice versa. The predator rate goes down and number goes down, the deer number goes up. So I would presume there's some variation according to population. Next slide. This is just the estimated cost for police response to deer calls. You can see the change over time. Again, it's been a bit up and down, and 2020 is a special circumstance, but we don't have the demand and the cost in 2019, for example, 2018 that we did in 2017. Next slide. This is the estimated cost to drivers. So in 2017, using 2013 dollars, it would be about $775,000. We're down in 2020 to something closer to $429,000 to date. And so there's a significant cost to, and we would assume that the population of the deer impacts the risk to drivers. That if we're taking out several hundred deers over the course of several years, then there are several hundred fewer chances of hitting a deer on the road. Next slide. Here are some of the factors we can control or have some influence on, and some we can't. We don't directly affect human population, presumably, nor the speed on highways, traffic density, weather or snowpack, or habitat outside of the city, which in theory some of those could drive deer into the city. We can have some impact on the deer population, interrupt the exponential growth, and to some degree we can influence habitat on private property through zoning, and we can certainly control habitat on city property. Next slide. Urban deer havens appears to be the most comprehensive resource. They are citing another study which concludes that the hunting's the most practical, cost-effective means. Obviously, that's not the only opinion out there. Next slide. From deer havens, there are 5 pages essentially discussing and comparing lethal and non-lethal techniques. We're using controlled hunting there at the top, and then at the bottom on the left column, we're using trap and euthanize. And these tend to be publicly funded or they have a controlled program to make sure that those who are carrying it out, whether they're private or whether they're hired by a city or county, are proceeding in a humane manner. And that's what our plan tries to do. These comparisons are ordered generally from more effective to less effective. Next slide. The top 2/3 of the left-hand column essentially are private matters, seeking to get residents to use deer-resistant plants. The last third of the page deals with barriers, physical barriers such as fencing, and those could be private or public or a partnership of those. On the next page, again, oh, whoops, one slide back, John, excuse me. But on the right-hand portion of the slide, there are distraction techniques, ways of scaring deer off in the upper portion. Deer tend to habituate to things like lights or noises, even to dogs to some degree. And some of the methods used can be a nuisance to neighbors. For example, turning on sprinklers, shooting paintballs at deer, or turning on lights at various times. And the lower one, introducing predators. It's expensive. It doesn't seem to be practical or desirable in an urban setting. And its effectiveness is directly tied to the density of the deer per acre. Next slide. Something like sterilization doesn't actually affect the deer population as much as it affects the fertility of the individual deer, and it's extremely costly. The trap and locate, as I think probably DWR decided, was an expensive and less effective method, particularly because there was a relatively low, or at least a disappointing survival rate for those that were translocated. And then the very bottom one there is, we do nothing and we accept the consequences of an overabundance of deer in our urban area. Next slide. We did have a question about fencing, and I think this would be costly from what I can tell. It appears that the UDOT roads are the ones where most of our deer are hit and killed. UDOT tends to do the multi-mile, multi-million-dollar fencing projects. They couple that with crossings placed along migration routes so that the deer can cross safely. That may involve overpasses, culverts, bridges, and the fences, of course, eliminate crossings in certain areas and funnel the animals in the rural areas, at least, to the overpasses, bridges, or culverts. Next slide. I think it would be quite challenging to try to do this within the city limits. We'd have to get permission from Utah to fence both sides of the roadways, and because UDOT controls access to their roadways. The cost should be quite significant to purchase land or the easements for the fencing. The cost of the fencing itself, its installation and maintenance on both sides of the roads appears to be significant. The traffic flow and the deer funneling would apparently have to occur at major intersections, could create safety issues of its own. And there would be a potential disruption of access to people's homes and businesses. And some people would consider it to have a negative aesthetic impact. Next slide. This is just a review of what we're paying for with our deer program. You have the first 3 points are essentially the equipment. The last one is the labor. It's a very labor intensive program. And to some degree, I think the sportsmen, the specialists who are highly trained are basically donating their hours because they don't like to see deer killed on the highway. They want deer that are harvested. They want the meat to be used, and they're willing to do it. Next slide. The appropriation for the short 2020 season would be up to 7625. That's about the cost of 1.48 crashes. For 21 and 22, the estimate would be 12,005 to take up to 32 deer from 4 sites, and that's about 2.16 crashes. I don't know how we know how many crashes we haven't had because of the hundreds of deer that have been taken out, if we count the population that has been interrupted. I would guess that it would not be overstating it to suppose that we're preventing perhaps 1 to 3 crashes a year. Whether that's considered cost effective by the council is up to you. That's the presentation I have. If I can answer questions, I'd be glad to do it.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. That was very, very informative. Appreciate you doing all that research and providing that information to us. Speaking for myself, I think it was very helpful, and your work on this has always been helpful. I have just one question, maybe in preparation for this evening. I think I would be happy if I knew that we were, if we were going to fund this program, we were also, it just seems like there's some hot spots in the city, and I don't think we need to set up fences or anything overly drastic, but at the very least, it seems like just putting some signage at those hot spots on State Street and on University Avenue, where it seems like the majority of the accidents are happening, that we might be able to reduce, some. Obviously, there are times when accidents are unpreventable, meaning that the driver isn't at fault. But if there's just a little bit more awareness about cautionary areas, especially I'm assuming at night, that would help reduce the likelihood of accidents, I think that would be very helpful. But I don't have a sense of how pricey that would be. So I don't know if there's a way to include some extra signage in this program, or whether that needs to be done separately. But that's my interest in my question, I guess.
That has not been included in the urban deer control plan. My understanding is that the signage along state routes would have to be done in conjunction with UDOT, and probably Public Works would be more familiar about how we might approach that with UDOT.
Okay, so that would be just a conversation that we would want to have with Public Works to see whether there's funding for something like that, or we would need to get some.
I frankly don't know. I would assume that most of the signage within the way along the state roads is either UDOT signage, or it is signage that was approved by UDOT. So I think that might be the place to start, would be to talk to Public Works. They have contacts with people at UDOT and see about the appropriateness of signage, and how close or how far away from the roadway it would have to be, both to be effective and also to be safe, and whether those should be permanent or temporary signage.
Okay, thank you. I'll follow up. Mr. Fillmore?
Jamil, thank you for a very thorough presentation. It was very helpful. I'm certainly not opposed to signage, Mr. Chairman, the appropriate signage. I have to say, I've gotten quite a bit of emails on this one, not nearly as much as some of the more controversial issues we've dealt with this year, but surprisingly, probably a couple dozen emails, and every one of them is in favor. This is in the northeast part of town in District 1. Everyone is in favor of continuing the current urban deer program, both for safety reasons as well as property damage reasons. I haven't detected one iota of a, what you might call a Bambi sentiment, just the sense that the danger factor, the property damage factor is substantial, and that it's really a low-cost program. This is not at all expensive. It appears to have been somewhat effective. I don't think we're ever going to eradicate the program, but I'm very much in favor of it. I would, another comment I would add, a couple of comments that Camille made had to do with predators. And just this week, in fact, just yesterday, there was a cougar roaming the neighborhood on the north end of Foothill Drive. And one of the neighbors took a short video of it. I'm sure it was pretty alarming to the folks in that vicinity. And I don't know if anybody's aware of what happened. They called animal control. I don't know if they caught the animal, euthanized it, or what, but the cougar population appears to be alive and well as well as the deer population. Clearly not the same numbers, but it is of some concern.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. I have actually received criticism of the program, and I'm not a fan of either stereotype, the rats with horns or the Bambi. I think the legitimate concern is whether or not it's whether we're trying to prevent accidents or whether we're trying to prevent nuisance.
Or both.
Yeah, or both. But I've raised that question earlier, and my priority was and is accidents. I think that's the most important thing to work to reduce. But I don't, as I've looked into this carefully, I recognize that this may be both the most cost-effective and reasonable way to do this, but without perfect results. And that's why I think I would like to see more aggressive efforts to promote driving safety and maybe promote some of those other measures that people ought to be aware of anyway. Just the things that you can do to interact with the deer population, even if you can't get rid of them all the time and in every instance. So anyway, that's I do think those are legitimate concerns, but I just want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce the accidents.
Sure.
All right. Any other comments on this item before this one will return to us this evening? If not, we have a 10-minute break. So we will, Mr. Shipley, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll delay the break for just a second. My question is logistically, if we vote on this, are we voting for the 3 years of it, or are we voting to have to look at this every year?
Thank you for that question. That actually was also on my mind. I think Mr. Sewell had raised that issue earlier as well.
Let me weigh in and say the resolution that you're considering is for the express purpose of, well, let me back up and put it this way. The contract was written as a one-year contract with 2 automatic renewals unless you gave notice, unless the city gave notice by a certain date that they didn't intend to renew. We've actually already missed the deadline for not renewing. So the contract is already valid for this year. What's actually in front of you is a proposal to amend the contract, which the other party of the contract has agreed to, in order for the city to pay less than they would otherwise be required, because they're going to do less sites than would otherwise be required by the contract, and then to appropriate the money to pay that reduced amount. The contract would otherwise remain the same and would be subject to automatic renewal next year. And my understanding from the administration is that they already have plans to automatically put into the budget the amount necessary for that automatic renewal so that it would not come back to you next year.
Thank you.
And subsequently, by your adoption of forthcoming budgets, it would already be there.
Very helpful. Appreciate that. Okay. Let's take a break, but it was supposed to be a 10-minute break, and I believe in 10-minute breaks. So let's come back at 3:20. Thank you. with item number, 7, which is a discussion of proposed amendments from the sign committee to Provo City Code regarding electronic sign hold times. And this will be presented by Hannah Salzel, our policy analyst, and Javin Weaver from City Planning.
Hey, I'm hoping my camera's working. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So the sign committee has refined some of its proposals. In our last discussion, there were a lot of different questions raised. And the committee has decided that they think the most effective use of our time is to pin down, at least in the code, what exactly we mean by long and short hold times before we try to define what areas should be long and short hold times. It seems like it could be counterproductive to do it the other way, putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. So this will be only addressing the hold times for the zones and some really basic code cleanup that I'll run through. Issues like where signs should be prohibited, if they should continue being permitted where they are permitted, the size of different signs, things like that will be addressed in subsequent steps. For now, this is just hold times and some basic code cleanup, as was shown in the attachments in the agenda packets. And there were 2 sections of code that the committee is proposing to amend, and both of those are now working online. One of them was uploaded as the wrong file type. I'll claim that, but it's able to be viewed now. So feel free to look at those as we're discussing. The committee is proposing 5 changes. The first is the basic code cleanup that would just change the language from churn to hold times to standardize in Provo City Code. It would also add VLDR, LDR, MDR, and HDR to that section that prohibits digital signs in residential and agricultural zones, just specifying to answer the question that was asked last time. Yes, those count as residential zones, and for the sake of permitting digital signs in residential zones. The second is to change the short hold time from 8 seconds, which is the current city norm, to 1 minute. And just for some comparison and context, last year I looked at 13 other local and comparable, as much as the city can be comparable to Provo, cities, and the most common hold time for about half of them was 8 seconds. This is also the state standard. It seems like sort of the default. The shortest hold time, one city had a hold time of 3 seconds, and the longest hold time was the 8 seconds that we saw among most of them. 1 minute is 7.5 times as long as that. The hope is that we can still help our businesses be competitive, but maintain the atmosphere and the safety that make Provo Provo. The committee thought 1 minute was a good compromise. The second point of this is that the short hold time would be 15 seconds rather than 1 minute if the sign represented 20 or more tenants in an S3 zone. It's important to understand that these are the exception areas, not the rule. There are only a few of these in the proposal. Sign size is determined by with a formula by building frontage, which makes it really difficult for businesses like a strip mall or a major area like the mall to share a sign because they all share that building frontage. Businesses along University Avenue specifically have complained that although the city permits retail in that area, it then makes them really difficult to have the signage they need to survive, especially as signage does serve an advertising purpose, but also a place marking location or place marking function. As you're driving past, to be able to tell when you should turn by looking for your business sign is really critical for a business. And if 20 tenants are sharing one marquee sign, their signs are sometimes as big as this. I went out this morning and looked at some, which is really difficult to see from the road. Here are some of my examples today. I don't know if you can tell, but some of these little signs are for Spicy Thai because their little advertisement here hadn't been serving them well enough as a place marker. This is a different sign, not the opposite side of the same sign, which shows the same problem. As you're driving down, especially from the other side of the road, it is really difficult.
I can't see your slides.
You can't see my slides?
I can't see what you're showing.
Well, I will have to run back through them really fast. Sharing my screen must not have worked. I will run back through. Well, we'll cover this really quickly. These are the multi-tenant signs I was talking about. These pictures here or these little signs here for Spicy Thai help supplement their signage here, which apparently they found to be inadequate, which makes it really difficult for businesses. Driving past, it's difficult to tell that that's So Delicious. You might recognize the Applebee's logo, but if not, it's difficult to find. So the point of permitting them to share a digital sign that they could rotate through more quickly at the 15 seconds rather than 1 minute would still let them share a sign. You could still put 2 to 4, whatever, different business names or logos on the sign at once, but show them in a way that's much more visible and still is about twice as long as as the state hold time, and even the longest hold time for surrounding cities. The third change is to change the long hold time from 3 times per day. The idea of that was just that it might be able to let a restaurant change their menu from breakfast, lunch, and dinner to 1 hour, which obviously is much, much longer than the 8 seconds that we've seen as the longest hold time in other cities. This would apply everywhere in Provo, except in the identified short hold time areas and in areas where digital signs are prohibited, which are these agricultural and residential zones. It's also maybe worth noting that none of the other cities I looked at distinguish between long and short hold times. This seems to be something pretty unique to Provo. One thing that's worth going back at before we leave hold times is actually it's on a preview on the next slide. We're on our way there. Perfect. We would also change city code just to update some of the list of short hold time areas, but this would be revisited as part of our larger discussion later about where signs should be permitted. It includes these 10, most of which are already in Provo City Code as short hold times of currently 8 seconds. This would extend the hold time to 1 minute. So in areas like University or like State Street, it would actually lengthen their current short hold time from 8 seconds to 1 minute. We also wanted to update the Provo Riverbottom University design or University Avenue design corridor. This question came up last time, and incorrectly, members of the committee said that electronic signs or digital signs are not permitted in that corridor. That is incorrect. They are currently permitted. That was the intent of the code anyway, when it was last changed back in January 2018. We realize now the word is potentially ambiguous, which is why some members of the committee thought they weren't permitted. They are, and this would clarify that the versions of signs that are permitted could also be permitted in digital versions. For example, if a monument sign is not permitted, but they are, but if it weren't permitted, you couldn't then have a digital monument sign and make that loophole. This is just clarifying what's already intended with the code. Some things that we plan to address in the future, again, where signs are permitted and prohibited. We're not trying to address that right now. We will come back with that probably in a couple of months. We will address buffer zones and other potential requirements. Buffer zones are areas like if the digital sign is within 100 feet of a residential zone, it has to be dimmed or off between 12 or like midnight and 6 a.m., something along those lines. That was fairly common in other cities we looked at. Provo doesn't currently have it, but we'll look at it in the future. Sign size, and then any questions that arise as we're going through the rest of the questions that we have. That is all I had for my portion of the committee's proposal. I'll let Javin just kind of run through the maps just to clarify, but do we have any quick questions on what's actually being proposed before I go to the maps?
Mr. Sewell.
Thank you for another excellent presentation, Hannah. I just did want to clarify one thing. We actually were proposing to include the list of staff recommendations as far as which areas would be short and long. If you look in the documents on in the agenda packet, the proposed ordinance changes, it includes those changes in that list. What we were deferring was a larger question of, in addition to changing the long and short hold times, are there more areas that we want to ban electronic signs completely, like downtown? We thought that would be a bigger discussion, and that's why we want to defer that particular question for next time.
Thank you. That's what I intended, but I guess that's not what I conveyed. So thank you for clarifying.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Mr. Weaver, were you going to add something? Oops, you're muted.
I can share my screen, please. In the neighborhood moment.
He needs to share the screen.
I sent out a message earlier to staff to promote Javin so he can share his screen and the maps.
Okay, you should be able to do it now.
Just to walk you through this. Currently, the pink is going to show all commercial areas in the city, which would essentially be of a long hold. Just to zoom in on the map so you understand this. The orange is our recommendation for multi-tenant. Yellow would be short hold areas. The teal is going to be what we currently have for short hold areas. So we'll be recommending to add areas adjacent to Shops River Woods to be part of the multi-tenant area. University Parkway is currently we recommend it to be a multi-tenant area. State Street for 1720 North, recommend that area be changed from short hold to a long hold right here. Between Cougar and 1720, that would stay the same. Cougar Boulevard would stay the same as short hold. Freedom Boulevard continue to be a short hold. That would extend down to 100 North. 820 North would continue to be a short hold, and that would continue on the freeway. We would add in Draper Lane as that continues to develop in that area. Center Street from 12th or 13th West to 600 West would continue to be a long hold, I apologize, versus short hold as a recommendation. University Avenue would continue from 600 South, which is essentially the railroad tracks, southward towards Lakeview Parkway. We would recommend it to be a multi-tenant area. Additionally, Town Center Boulevard, Lakeview Parkway, recommend that to be long hold, and State Street, recommend that to be changed from a long hold to a short hold area.
The way around. Good.
Any questions?
Mr. Sewell.
Thanks, Gavin. Just on that last one, that one was backwards. We're recommending that it go from a short hold to a long hold on South State Street.
Thank you for the correction, my mistake.
Okay, no problem, thank you.
Do you know how many miles that is? On University, 1860, and then State Street?
I think it's about 3.2 miles. Might
Combined?
be from 640 South is where it is, down to the city boundary line. Which
That's
again is, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So that's 3.4, 3.5, and then 1860 is another 2 miles.
Mile or so, I cannot recall.
And then University is maybe another 1.5 miles.
Ish.
Okay. Do you feel like 1860 is a true commercial corridor? It seems pretty industrial to me.
Well, the uses all along this corridor do allow for signs varying from PF, PIC zones and other zones that all would allow for some type of a electronic sign as the code is currently written.
Yeah, I've had this concern before. I'm sorry that I sound like a broken record, but half of South State Street is residential, right? It's largely residential at this point. And maybe this is a conversation that I can have with staff and bring back to the council, but is this area of South State Street supposed to be commercial or residential? Because if it is supposed to be residential, then I would encourage the sign committee to bring back a shortened version of this where it's not so long, where it's not so expansive and inclusive of South State Street. If it is truly to be a commercial corridor, then we should we should plan for that. We should permit signs, and we should kind of exclude residential uses from being adjacent to commercial uses.
So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about, where we're just defining what short and long hold times should be for Provo, and then we'll go look and make sure. So for right now, all the sign committee is proposing is that this area that is currently a short hold time with 8 seconds be changed to a long hold time of 1 hour. And then in our subsequent discussions, this is number one on our list of places to review for whether or not this should be reclassified, whether signs should be permitted, if so, to what degree, buffer zones, things like that. But we realized there was a lot more nuance with this area, and we needed to pin down some of the definitions like long and short hold times before we could move forward with addressing all the nuance.
Okay. I also had a conversation with staff last week about making some tweaks to the southeast area plan, so that might influence some of the recommendations that come from the committee.
Shannon, if I may ask you a question, would you recommend that there not be any electronic signs between 640 to Lakewood Parkway, but allow for electronic signs on a long hold basis south of here? Would that be your recommendation?
Yeah, I think that's my tentative recommendation. Even a little north of 1860 South, I would, like a quarter mile, you might include signs if the area south of there has a commercial flavor. If the area south of there is going to be residential for the next 100 years, then no, just cut it off at 1860.
I think we'd be happy to meet with you, have you come to one of these committee meetings when we're discussing this. That would be really helpful.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, we're over time on this item, so we have 2 more comments. I'll ask my counselors to be brief. Mr. Harding? You're muted.
Thank you. Wow. I will do my best to be brief. Can we share that screen real quick? My understanding, and if I'm misunderstanding this, help me, but my understanding is pretty much everywhere that's pink on that, which is just about most of the city, anywhere that's pink is basically a long hold time. And the only reason that South State Street was marked there is because it's currently a short hold time, and it's being proposed to be converted to a long hold time. And so once it's converted to a long hold time, then it's just like every other pink marked area in the entire city. And so so it's basically being treated like everywhere else, except for the places that are either going to be converted to short hold time or are already short hold time. And so then the question, if we're saying that that's too intense, then I think we at that point would have to revisit our a council decision from a couple of years ago, which was basically to allow electronic signs anywhere that backlit signs are allowed, which is pretty much any commercial area. So, boy, I've a whole lot of little thoughts here. So I think Provo is unique because of that decision, because we said, hey, you know what, an electronic sign that doesn't change is no more obtrusive than a backlit sign. So why would we allow backlit signs in some areas where we don't allow electronic signs? Or let me say that the other way. Why would we not allow electronic signs anywhere that we have backlit signs? And so we have. And so because we look at some of our sister cities and they have a billboard, thing that says that billboards can change, electronic billboards can change every 8 seconds. That is a very different scope than every single commercial establishment in the city being allowed to have an electronic sign and then allowing churn on those signs. And that the purpose of the 3 times a day wasn't specifically for change of menus, or maybe the idea was, well, we could allow up to that, but really the purpose of having really only allowing in long-term hold areas very few changes per day was the idea that if we're saying these are equivalent to backlit signs, then we need to treat them like backlit signs. And how often would someone change a backlit sign? maybe gas stations with their long poles might change the cost of the gas, more than once a day, but it was really should be maybe even no more than once a day. But we said, well, let's move it to 3 for that reason. And to me, that's the reason why we're doing that. I agree that signs are critical for place marking, but even rotating every 15 seconds, unless you can show every place on every store that's in that location, even switching it 15 seconds on and 15 seconds off is not going to function as a place marking. So I am struggling with that as well. Let me say though that I support moving this forward, and I think the next step is to get more community feedback, and I support that. I do hope that while we're getting that community feedback, that we can maybe discuss possible tweaks to this. For example, one thing that occurred to me today. Right now, we prohibit in certain zones, and those are residential and agricultural zones. It seems like that list might even be smaller if we did the opposite. Instead of prohibiting it in these zones, if we were to allow it in commercial and industrial zones, in particularly because we have a bunch of PRO zones and a bunch of, I don't remember what some of the other designations are, but that are mostly residential in nature. And so it just seems like it might be cleaner to specify where they're allowed rather than a whole long list of what they're prohibited. And I guess that is, then one other question, and I guess we don't have to discuss it now, but just know that it's a question I have. It seems to me that we're marking long hold zones, short hold zones, and now I heard just today, I don't remember hearing it earlier, multi-tenant zones. And I thought multi-tenant was basically they were allowed to have slightly different things, but I didn't think it was like a whole designation, a whole area. So if someone doesn't have multi-tenants but's in a multi-tenant zone, can they switch every 15 seconds? Or if a multi-tenant is in a short hold time, can they not rotate every 15 seconds? So that's a question I have. I don't need an answer for that now, but I do support moving this forward and getting some public feedback, but I'm still not comfortable with some of it. I would like to see some additional tweaks, but I am happy to support this going out to the public now.
Feel free to send us emails with any suggested additional tweaks.
Mr. Sewell?
Thank you. I've had some really good comments. Just a couple of things real quick. The multi-tenant, there isn't really a separate designation for multi-tenant. That was more of a sort of looking at the map convenience. So the way we've defined it is if you're in the short hold time area, and if you're in an SC3 zone, and if the sign is representing more than 20 or more tenants, then you get the 15 seconds. Everyone else in the short hold time area is the 1 minute, except for that. So, so to wrap up, what we were hoping for is to get a thumbs up or thumbs down from the council as to whether we can move just this hold time issue and the designation of which areas are short hold time. If we can move that onto Open City Hall to get public input in preparation for bringing it back. And then we're going to have a bigger discussion about well, let me put it like this. I think this proposal represents a huge step forward in improving safety and aesthetics for our community related to digital signs. But now the next big question is, do we want to go even farther? Do we want to ban digital signs completely downtown? Do we want to ban digital signs completely in certain other areas, such as what Councillor Ellsworth has suggested? So that would be our next topic. So, Mr. Chair, I'm just asking for some sort of confirmation as to whether we can move ahead with getting the public input on this part of the proposal.
Well, I think we've heard from Mr. Harding on that question. I'm certainly supportive. If there's anybody who has any reservations, now is a good time to speak. Otherwise, we will assume we are supportive and we can move on.
Okay.
All right, so I think we're safe to go ahead. You're safe to go ahead then. We appreciate the work of your committee and the staff. We know how complex this issue is, and it's good to, you know, take small bites one at a time, I guess, to get through this. So thank you. Now we have a series of land use items now that we're going to move through. We're a little over time, but I think we're probably okay as long as we can move through these relatively quickly, remembering that we're going to be talking about these this evening. So the first is item number 8, an ordinance amending the zone map classification of approximately 18 acres of real property generally located at 1920 South, 500 West, from agricultural to low density residential. This is in the Lakewood neighborhood, and Aaron Ardmore will present.
Thank you. And I see John's pulling up those slides right now. So this area, if we can go to the next slide. Oh. I believe this is the wrong set of slides, right? Around D.R. Horton's. Sorry, I just realized I had control. No, that's not it. There we go. Thank you. All right. So here's the area. So you'll see to the north is the Osprey subdivision. Here's 500 West. Here's Lakeview Parkway. So the applicants, D.R. Horton, have been working with the city for quite some time on trying to get this concept plan to a point where we could feel good about the zone change. So they have done that while providing a development agreement on certain conditions with the right of way along 500 West and the Parkway here. The zone itself meets the, as we just go through these, the zone itself meets the general plan and the Southwest area future land use plan that have been adopted by the council. This area was designated for a low density residential zone, which has been provided through this request. The phasing plan, we can go back to that, meets the recent code adoption through Public Works of only allowing 40 at a time as to sewer infrastructure constraints. So we took this in front of Planning Commission most recently on October 14th, and then again on October 28th, where Planning Commission recommended approval on the zone change and approved the concept plan attached with that. I have more details on that concept plan. I don't know if that's needed, but I guess I'll just turn it over to the council at this point to discuss the zone change request.
All right, thank you. Any comments on this item, Mr. Harding?
Do we know if the developer will be there this evening?
They will be, yeah.
Okay. I do, I guess, have some concerns what the intended demographic is, what the target demographic is for this development. But I think I'll ask them when they're here. And then just I'm not sure what to do at this point. Back when years ago when we were working on the West Provo Development Policies Committee, and We talked about things like a variety of housing types, interspersed, and to me that did not mean just 3 different styles of townhomes, and 200 plus units of townhomes all concentrated in one development. But I really don't know what to do at this point. I feel I'm not certain that even our zoning allows for the kind of intermixing that I was hoping to see when we came up with those policies. But anyway, so those are the things that are on my mind.
Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I'm curious if I just watched the first planning commission meeting, I think from a month or 2 ago, where this was presented, and the staff had concerns about the orientation of the doors, I think on the sides of the building. Aaron, do you feel like they adequately addressed that or really met the spirit of the code? What do you think?
So what you're alluding to is they technically did address that. I think that we have some work to do with our design standards to not allow just a door on that street-facing wall, which isn't really the front of the unit. I think we have some work to do with our design standards to address that. But technically, as the code reads at their application, they meet the requirement.
Okay. And did you have, I've heard a couple of concerns about parking, that there's too much parking available, and that might encourage investors. But then you go to other developments and other parts of town and there's not enough parking. So, we're never going to get parking perfect, but does the staff feel comfortable with the parking situation?
Staff's opinion going into Planning Commission was that they are definitely overparked. There was a suggestion, not a condition, there's a suggestion from the Planning Commission that some of the parking along the private road and adjacent to the pickleball courts be removed and replaced with landscaping. We would definitely support that. When the project plan comes along, we would support that type of change, as we do feel it's greatly overparked.
Okay. Yeah, I would. Yeah, I feel supportive of that as well, but we won't address that tonight. Okay. Were there other major concerns that staff feels like has not been addressed?
The other concerns were worked out with the development agreement as far as maintenance and control of the open spaces. I think that we've gotten to a point of agreement on those issues.
Okay. And remind me, how will the street be treated on the north side of Lakeview Parkway? Is it going to be curb gutter sidewalk, curb gutter trail?
So there will be a curb and gutter, and then there's going to be a open space, and the developer is going to be installing a meandering pathway, which will serve as the public sidewalk before you get to their 4-foot fence and then their open space leading up to the units.
Okay.
I can have the details shown tonight.
Okay. This might be something to address in a different meeting or offline, but I'm not a big fan of meandering sidewalks. They're usually not good for people in wheelchairs. They're usually not good for people with strollers. They're usually not good for people who are runners or people who are commuting from point A to B. And they cost more. They take up more concrete. So that's my soapbox on curvilinear sidewalks.
Who are they good for is the question.
They look good in plan view and they look good from a car. Otherwise, they're not very useful.
They make me a little dizzy.
Yeah, yeah. You're definitely going to want to run on the other side of the road.
They're nice for people out taking an evening stroll, but yeah, for I think most sidewalk uses, I agree.
All right, any other questions before this evening on this item? All right, thank you, Mr. Ardmore, as always. We'll turn then to item number 9, which is an ordinance amending Provo City Code to increase the permissible lot coverage in the Del Coronado PRO Zone. This is in the Maeser Neighborhood, and Dustin Wright, City Planner, will present. Thanks for being with us, Dustin.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the applicant has requested a text amendment in the Del Coronado Zone. It's a very minor change to a what is just a very small zone within our city. So, I mean, I think in total it's about an acre of land that we're talking about, and it's already mostly developed. And so really it's the remaining portion of this PRO zone. It consists of 2 single-family lots that the applicant owns and would like to develop. And so amending the text in that will help him be able to do that. Currently, it says that 30% of the lot can be covered by the structure, and his request is to increase that to 35%. So that extra 5% will allow him to be able to get the, I think, the width that he needs to be able to, you know, fit the home on that lot. And so the request went before the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission wanted to take some time to have him come back and look at what you know, renderings or site plan he would be able to put there. So he brought that back to a following Planning Commission, showed them. I think they felt comfortable with that, and their recommendation was for approval of the text amendment, but they also felt comfortable going up to 40%, so 5% more than what the applicant requested. He would be fine with that 40%, but really he only needs the 35%, he said, to make that work. So staff support of the Planning Commission has forwarded their positive recommendation on. And if you have any specific questions for me, I'd be happy to answer those now.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Mr. Harding.
You mentioned earlier about it already being developed, and that's my question. There seems to be a building at least on one of the 2 lots that we're discussing. But then later I thought I read that there's 2 homes proposed. So I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, so in the Del Coronado zone, it's an acre of land. There's already like an apartment complex that's there. I think it's about 20 units that's existing. And so the remainder portion of that acre, there's 2 single family lots that they're both vacant. The applicant owns them both and would like to build a similar home on each lot. One of the lots is slightly, not much, but slightly bigger than the other one. And so the text amendment that he's requesting will make it so he could fit a similar home on each lot.
Is that recently vacated? Because even like Street View and things like that, we're showing that there's a building at least covering one of those 2 lots.
Yeah, so there's like a storage unit kind of thing in the middle of that parking lot area that you're probably looking at. That's going to be removed.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Shipley.
So planning had suggested that we move this to 40%. We're voting on 35% tonight. Is there a reason that we should move this to 40% to make it consistent with other zones? I just didn't get the thought there whether or not we should change this to 40 for some. What was the good reasoning for doing that, and should we be looking at that?
Yeah, so the applicant requested 35, the bare minimum that he needed. He didn't want to get greedy. He just wanted to make sure it got approved so he could do this. The 40% came from one of the planning commissioners felt that since there's the single family zones that allow for 40%, the idea, I guess, there was just for consistency with those, and I guess to allow a little bit more flexibility in this situation. But I think it was just a consideration to be more consistent with other zones. Really, I don't think anyone is going to be able to look at it and be able to tell the difference between 35 and 40%, or even 30%, 35%. It's, to the untrained eye, I don't think anyone's going to be able to tell that there's a 5% more lot coverage on this lot.
So the staff recommendation is that we approve 35% because that's what is needed, and we don't need to worry about trying to be consistent with other zones with a 5% variance.
Yeah, that recommendation came from the Planning Commission. Staff's fine with either one. I think the applicant's fine with either one. So if the council feels one way or the other, then I think either way would be fine.
Ms. Ellsworth?
40% probably makes it easier to integrate this into like the other zones, right? If someday we're trying to get away from these pro zones, it just makes it more consistent.
Yeah, that's a good point. I suppose if the pro zone went away and we tried to make it one of our other zones, then that one requirement would probably fit more in line with those. Again, these are, you know, the 40%. That's a maximum. So even if it was changed to 40%, the applicant could still choose to do 30% lot coverage. No one's required to fill the lot with the maximum amount of coverage. That's just there to limit it, essentially.
I'm comfortable with 40%, and if I remember correctly, this project has just come back to us a couple of times because initially the lot lines were kind of funny and we didn't like that, and then we're trying to address it by helping them have better lot lines, but allowing them this increased coverage. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know the whole history on it, but yeah, it's been a zone that was created, I think, to help add these additional lots to kind of block the apartments in the back from the street view, and they would tie in better to the surrounding neighborhood of single family homes. That's kind of I think the general background of that Del Coronado Pro Zone.
Mr. Harding?
The item we're looking at in just 2 from now, item 12, is the one that had the funny lot lines and coverage and that kind of stuff. So that's coming up in 2 more.
All right, any more questions on this item? Thank you, Mr. Wright. We will continue then to item number 10, which is an ordinance amending the zone map classification of approximately 1.7 acres of real property generally located at 1320 South, 1080 East from residential R110 to low density residential LDR in the Spring Creek neighborhood. This is presented by Mr. Ardmore.
Thank you. Go to the image here. So here we are. So this is an area that you've seen a lot recently. There's a lot going on down here with a kind of different zone requests each time. So you can see to the east, there's medium density residential. To the north is a pro zone, then the park, and then to the west is a low density residential zone. That was developed by the same applicant. This time around, this remainder property that was surplus by the city around the power station is proposed to go to LDR zone so they can develop it as shown on the screen with single family homes, detached and attached. So you've got 10 twin homes, basically, 5 sets. And then you've got 8 single family homes wrapped around kind of a neighborhood open green area with some playground, barbecue, picnic areas, more picnic area up here. So this is the concept. Staff was pretty happy to receive this layout with a low density residential zone. We feel like the low density residential zone so far has just brought a lot of townhomes, as many as could fit on a property. Where in this case, we're getting some different product types, and we're pretty happy about getting different product types in this area to give us that variety of housing where you've got condos, apartments, townhomes, and now you've got some attached and detached single family homes. So staff was encouraged by that, recommended approval to the Plan Commission, which also recommended approval. So I'd like to know if there's any questions that I need to prepare for tonight with anything, any concerns that you would have.
Thank you, Mr. Ardmore. Any suggestions before this evening? All right, thank you so much. Well, there is a comment.
Sorry. I'll just add, this is like I don't want to say maybe the only project I'm excited about in this area. Thanks for helping us diversify the housing stock.
All right, we'll move on then to item number 12. Is that right? I don't want to, no, item number 11, right? Yes. This is an ordinance amending the zone map classification of approximately 1.07 acres of real property generally located at 50 East, 3900 North from residential R110 to low density residential LDR in the Riverbottoms neighborhood. Again, Mr. Ardmore, go ahead.
Thanks. So this one, much like the DR Horton, has been with staff for a while. We've been working through both with the Plan Commission and with staff, trying to address as many as the concerns as we could from the neighborhood with this zone, and more specifically with the concept plan attached to the zone. If you look at the map here, you've got the townhomes, the old Ivy townhomes here to the south. You've got the, what is it called? The assisted living and their townhomes and single family homes to the north. And then of course the Canyon Cove and Renewal subdivisions to the east. So it's taken a few iterations to get to this point for the concept to try to match the neighborhood a little bit better with the low density residential zone. They've brought it down to 10 units. There's a development agreement with this one tonight to limit it to those 10 units. The developer has tried to respect the LDR zone, not max it out, but also try to match house sizes to address those concerns of the neighborhood. We are aware that there's still a lot of neighbors that have concerns with an LDR zone in this area. Staff feels, if you read the staff report, feels that it's appropriate, being against University Avenue pretty much, and with the type of development in the area, the type of plan proposed, and with the development agreement to kind of guarantee that, helps staff feel comfortable with this zone change. So again, if there's anything you want me to bring tonight, just let me know.
Mr. Ardmore, I'd like to have, and if it's in the packet and I didn't catch it, I apologize, but I'd like to have a little bit of a sense. I mean, because I'm aware that there was another higher density development nearby. And as usual with these kinds of things, it would be helpful to have a sense of the distribution in the general area. Because it does seem to me, I mean, that's certainly on a lot of people's minds when we heard from the public, but it's always helpful to have a general sense of that. So I don't know if there's more information that you could bring to the meeting tonight, but that's one thing that occurs to me.
Are you asking for like a kind of a more zoomed out area of where that density has come, and not just this particular neighborhood?
Right, right. Yeah, this is kind of in an unusual location in a lot of ways. So yeah, just having a sense of what's in the immediate area would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I'll prepare that.
Any other, Ms. Ellsworth, go ahead.
Yeah, these aren't townhomes necessarily, are they? Or would they be classified as townhomes? They look like twin homes?
So yeah, you can see 3 of the 4 buildings are more of a twin home setup, with this building to the east is 4 townhomes. The LDR would allow either.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Ardmore. We'll then move on to item number 12, which is an ordinance amending the zone map classification of approximately 0.25 acres of real property generally located at 189 South, 500 West from residential conservation to low density residential in the Franklin neighborhood. And this will be presented by Brandon Larson.
Thank you, Commissioner or Council. So again, you've seen this before. This came before you about a month ago. You've got a gentleman who has property again about 2nd South and 5th West, and he would like to basically split his lot. He has a 10,000 square foot lot and would like to establish 2 single family dwellings. You can see the general vicinity of the property there. Again, on 2nd South and 5th West. We can go to the next slide. And the next slide after that, sorry. Thank you. So yeah, you can see the lot there outlined in orange. He's hoping to establish another dwelling site on the east side of that property. He originally proposed the VLDR zone, and then after going through a process, after there was a process to propose a text amendment to the LDR zone that wasn't successful, but was successful through the LDR zone, he amended his request to have his property rezoned to the LDR zone. The Planning Commission recommended approval of that rezone to the LDR zone, and so it's back to you. He want to update since you saw this beyond the change to the request for the zone for the LDR zone. He's now proffering a development agreement to limit the use to single family dwellings, because with the LDR zone or the VLDR zone for that matter, you can actually have townhomes and twin homes, and so he's stating that he'll limit the use of that property to single family only. Do you have any questions for me, council?
Thank you, Ms. Ellsworth.
Yeah, I'm curious if a development agreement like that prohibits someone from having an accessory dwelling unit.
In the LDR zone does not allow for accessory dwelling units, so it would truly limit it to single family only.
So he couldn't have it because of the zone, not necessarily because of the development agreement?
Yeah, the development agreement, he's not in the development agreement, he's not asking for anything more than single family, and then the LDR zone itself just wouldn't allow for accessory apartments.
Mr. Sewell.
I like the project. I was just have a little bit of a concern about having a little teeny tiny LDR zone inside a single family neighborhood like that. Just kind of wonder about the precedent that might set. Are there any other possible zones that would accommodate this project? I was just curious.
Glad you brought that up. There, if this screenshot, you can see this aerial image. There actually is an LDR zone already on this block. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't think I'm sharing my screen, but just you approved an LDR zone to the east and kind of far to the east of the block, and then kind of in the middle. That now, but there is a home in kind of the middle east of the block that's been raised, and yes, yeah, exactly. So that has been rezoned to the LDR zone. There are 3 homes being erected currently on that property. So this would not be the first requested LDR zone on the block. And as far as whether or not another zone would accommodate his request, I'm not aware of one.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Larson? All right, seeing none, we'll move on then to item number 13. It's an ordinance amending Provo City Code to section 15.03 to update engineering design standards for 2021. This has citywide application, and Mr. Ardmore has this item.
Let me just turn myself back on here, sorry. All right. So I'll be brief. This is Public Works, so David Day will be here tonight to expand on any questions or concerns with this, but it's basically the Public Works annual update for their standards and their manuals and their drawings. It's an annual thing. Planning staff proposed approval. Planning Commission the same, recognizing that it happens every year. But if you have any specific questions, David Day will be here tonight to answer.
Any questions?
This is David Day. I just wanted to point out one thing that we had that was a minor change since we visited with Planning Commission about this item. And it is a change that deals with the slag in around our utilities. So that is just, it's about 2 sentences of change. You'll see that in the changes packet portion of that item. So everything else is the same. There's about 31 pages that changed.
Thank you. Mr. Harding?
Yeah, thank you for that. I looked through it. I actually kind of like the annual updates. It gives me a chance to go in and take a look at the drawings and appreciate just how much what is in there for the standards, how much engineering work that goes into that. And so I appreciate that. And I looked through the 31 pages and whatnot. I believe, is it correct that we have seen, that the council has seen this before when we updated standards due to stormwater retention to detention, or are these additional changes to what we've already seen?
Yeah, so 14 of those pages you would have already approved as part of the stormwater design manual. And so, really there's just 17 new ones that are, for the most part, very minor changes, trying to fine tune things that are already working really well.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you. We'll return to this item again later. And we'll turn to our last item for the work session, which is item number 4 on the agenda, an ordinance amending Provo City Code regarding permitted uses in the Neighborhood Shopping Center, SC1, Community Shopping Center, SC2, and Regional Shopping Center, SC3 zones and related provisions. City Council, or excuse me, citywide application, and this will be presented by Mr. Weaver, Javin Weaver. You're muted, Mr. Weaver.
Thank you. If you can shift to the next slide, please, John. So this item was heard earlier this year in January. The primary concerns from that were, if we're leaving items within the as a conditional use within the SC1, 2, 3 zones, then what are those conditions? Staff looked closely at our conditional uses and saw that we actually have quite a few conditions already codified within our zone. And we thought, how can we make this better for city staff and also for the public to utilize our code? So staff is proposing to create a standards for conditional uses in section 1434-250. So primarily we have done Tetris with a lot of the conditions. Staff also went over this with Dave Harding a few months ago and went over these specifically and to kind of show the format and how we're going to go through this. Go to the next slide, please. So currently within these standards, we have bed and breakfast, liquor stores, dance halls, car wash, police satellite station, surplus stores, daycare services, fraternal organizations, restaurants with drive-through, veterinarian clinics, and communications. Next slide, please. So currently, all of these that have a section of code listed next to it are already codified. And so we just are shifted all of those from those aforementioned zones into this new zone of 250. We did add new text for a surplus store. Next slide, please. Additionally, the only new code that we're adding to it would be for fraternal associations and restaurants with drive-through. And within this presentation, I'm only going to discuss these sections of new code. If there are questions on our current code, that I think that should be a separate question and separate application, perhaps. Additionally, within section 1434-250, it does say the uses will also be subject to comply with additional conditions resulting from a planning commission hearing. In drafting these conditions, can't think of everything, and so this is giving us the ability to add additional conditions based on case-based scenarios. Next slide, please. So this would apply for surplus stores. The code would, these would be the conditions for it. I'm happy to go through these, and for each one, it says outdoor storage shall be screened by a 6-foot fence or other screening material. No hazardous material shall be stored on site, and loading areas shall not be adjacent to a residential property. Next slide. Outdoor for fraternal association and lodges. Outdoor lighting shall not extend onto an adjacent residential property, subject to the standards of section 906030, which deals with our noise ordinance in our public safety code. And then our last section of code to be added to this is restaurants with drive-through service. Outdoor lighting to be shielded to prevent spillage on adjacent residential properties. Dumpsters, outdoor dumpsters shall not be placed within 20 feet of a residential property and shall be screened. Drive-through microphones shall not be adjacent to residential property. Drive-through microphones shall not be louder than 78 decibels. And screening shall be provided to block vehicle lights from within the drive-through lanes when adjacent to residential property. Next slide. So again, this section is already codified. I noticed in this section, items 2 and 3 require that a conditional use permit be applied and granted for these 2 uses. So 2 and 3 were shifted to the new section of conditional uses 250. Next slide. Since all of these have been changed, each of these 10 conditions are listed within any of these aforementioned zones. Under conditions, the text has been added to say, and the standards of section 1434-250. So if someone were to come to one of these sections, they would know to go to that section to look for the conditional uses. Next slide. Within the SC1, 2, and 3 zones, we saw a couple of things that were duplicates. We have lot area and area of zone within SC1. We feel like we should keep lot area, which describes the SC zone to be no more than 5 acres. If it becomes 5 acres, then we recommend that that becomes a SC2 due to the intensity of land uses within that zone. Next slide. And this was just a duplicate, and so we're just taking this section out and leaving the lot area. Still, it would be at least 5 acres and 5 acres for an SC2 zone. Next slide. And this is just a duplicate of it. So again, taking that out of the code. So already saying lot area can be 20 acres or larger for SC3. Are there any questions for staff?
Mr. Harding.
Thanks. So, for example, we have some conditions on restaurants with drive-throughs. Does that apply to all restaurants with drive-throughs in the city, or only restaurants with drive-throughs in zones in which they are just a conditional and not a permitted use?
Only when on zones where they are a condition.
Thank you.
Yes.
Other questions? Harding, go ahead.
I got another one. Thank you. Thank you for your work on this. This is looking really good. When I first started going through the material to prepare for today, I think the first three, I'm guessing, were just left over from the last time the item was brought here, because I was going through this thinking like, this looks the same as what we were looking at last time, and it wasn't until I got later I'm like, oh, okay, so this is now something different. So I'm thinking those first ones were just again left over, but I assume because we've now created these conditions for the conditional, but there's some areas, some SLUs that were conditional before, but we didn't write conditions for. So do we know, were all of those then just bumped to permitted? Were some bumped to permitted and some just excluded completely?
So every condition that's listed within, that's left within a SC zone, any condition, SLU codes that are going to be there, they all have conditions that are codified or have been drafted and were presented in this presentation.
Okay.
So however, if you have a zone that is not an SC 123 zone that has other SLU codes that are that other land uses that are considered conditions, some of them would be codified within a zone already, or they would be drafted into it. And next phases of it would be good to go through the other zones and look at these. So then this section of 1434-250 can continue to be revised and add additional conditions as we see additional land uses that need to be main conditioned. We can add into it.
Okay. I guess, for example, on the old proposal, I think the very first few SLUs, there were some that were kind of subsections within communications, but the proposal was just to move the whole kind of macro category of communications into the permitted, just to kind of condense that and whatnot. I guess, so I saw that as I was preparing. I went through all of that and thought, okay, they're still doing this proposal, but a bunch of other things we had talked about hadn't changed. And then finally I got to these other things that looked very different, and I only got partway through it and I was so confused on what was actually being proposed. So right now at this point, I'm not, what document should I look at to see what changes are actually being made? I mean, I see these things, these conditional ones that you've gone over, but are there other SLUs that used to be conditional and are just being moved to permitted? And are there like larger classifications that only certain things under there were permitted and now we're approving or permitting the whole thing? Where would I find that so I could see what we're actually being asked to approve tonight?
That would be in the attachment that John prepared for you, showing the SC 123 zones, showing the land uses shifting from what we discussed previously. So since we already discussed that, I thought we were good to move forward on this and continue to discuss the conditions at this discussion. So, but
okay, no, yeah, that's fine. I'm just wondering, like, maybe we could talk about this right after we close the meeting. But during my dinner break, I was hoping to kind of go over what kind of the final proposal. I mean, again, I think you've done a great job talking about what the conditions are on the things that are still conditional, but it seemed like there were more things that were used to being conditional that were moving to permitted, and I just wanted to look over that one more time. But I guess we can talk after this meeting, so I can get that.
Other comments? All right, thank you, Mr. Weaver, and that will bring us to the end of our items for this work session. A closed session has not been requested, so we will, if there is no objection, we will now adjourn by unanimous consent, and we will begin our evening meeting at 5:30 p.m. So Thank you all for participating and being a part of this, and we'll see you in an hour.